The knock on the door came too early, and Alara Whitmore knew before she opened her eyes that something had gone terribly wrong. Her father's voice was shaking on the other side of the door, and that alone was enough to send a cold wave through her chest, because her father never shook. He was a man built from iron and pride, a man who had once stared down a room of furious creditors without blinking, and now his voice cracked like thin ice under a boot. She rose from bed, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door to find him standing in the hallway with a letter crushed in his fist. His eyes were red, though whether from tears or sleepless nights, she could not tell. Behind him, the candles in the hall burned low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her like grasping fingers. "They are coming for the house," he said. "Tomorrow. Unless something changes tonight, we lose everything." Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The Whitmore estate had been the only home she had ever known. Its gardens the place where she had learned to walk, its library the place where she had learned to dream. To lose it was to lose the last solid thing in a world that had already taken her mother, her brother, and most of her father's fortune in the span of 3 cruel years. "What can we do?" she asked, though some part of her already feared the answer. Her father did not speak at first. He walked past her, into the small sitting room at the end of the hall, sank into a chair, and stared at the letter, as though it might change its words if he looked at it long enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "There is one man who could save us, the Duke of Ashcombe. He holds every debt against this house, every one. If he wished, he could ruin us tonight, and no court in the land would stop him." "Then we are already ruined," Alara said. "Not if you marry him." The words landed like a blow. For a moment Alara could not breathe. She had heard of the Duke of Ashcombe, of course. Everyone had. Alaric Vane, a man who had once been the most sought-after bachelor in the country, admired for his sharp mind and his sharper wit, until a carriage accident 3 years ago left him unable to walk. Since then he had vanished from society almost entirely, seen only rarely, and always seated, always silent, always surrounded by a coldness that visitors described as unbearable. Some called him bitter, others called him cruel. A few, in hushed voices, called him something worse, a man broken beyond repair, dangerous in his despair. "He asked for me," Alara said, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. "He asked for a wife who would bring no scandal, no complications, and no expectations of affection. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. In exchange, every debt is cleared. The house is saved. Your sisters will have their dowries. It is the only door left open to us, Alara, and it is closing fast." She looked at her father, at the deep lines etched into his face by worry, at the way his hands trembled around the letter, and she understood that this was not truly a choice being offered to her. It was a sentence, dressed up in polite words, and she was the only one who could carry it out. "When would the wedding be?" she asked. 3 days from now. 3 days. 3 days to leave behind everything she knew, and step into a life with a stranger, whose name alone made grown men lower their voices. She thought of the gardens outside her window, of the long afternoons spent reading beneath the old oak tree, of the quiet, ordinary life she had once imagined for herself, a life with laughter in it, perhaps even love. All of it dissolved in an instant, replaced by the image of a cold, silent man in a chair, waiting to claim her as one claims a debt repaid. "I will do it," she said, because there was truly nothing else to say. Her father's shoulders sagged with relief, though guilt flickered across his face as well. Guilt he did not have the courage to voice aloud. He thanked her, kissed her forehead, and left her standing alone in the sitting room, with the candles burning low, and her future rearranged in the space of a single conversation. That night, Alara did not sleep. She sat by her window and watched the moon climb over the hills, and she tried to imagine the man she was about to marry. She had seen him once, years ago, at a ball before the accident, when he still moved through rooms with an easy confidence that made every woman present take notice. He had been tall then, with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, and he had laughed at something a friend said, a real laugh, warm and unguarded. She wondered if that man still existed somewhere inside the cold figure society now whispered about, or if the accident had taken him entirely, leaving only the shell behind. The next 3 days passed in a blur of fittings and arrangements. A seamstress arrived to alter a wedding gown that had once belonged to Alara's mother, and Alara stood still as pins were pressed into the fabric, staring at her own reflection as though it belonged to someone else. Her younger sister, Marianne, cried openly at the news, begging her not to go through with it, but Alara only held her close and told her it would be all right, even though she did not believe it herself. On the morning of the second day, a carriage arrived from Ashcombe Hall, sent to collect Alara's father for a meeting with the Duke's solicitor to finalize the terms of the marriage contract. Alara insisted on going as well, unwilling to let her fate be decided entirely without her presence. The ride to Ashcombe Hall took nearly 2 hours, winding through hills and forests that grew increasingly wild and untamed the closer they came to the estate. When the carriage finally rolled through the iron gates, Alara pressed her face to the window and stared. Ashcombe Hall was enormous, a sprawling structure of gray stone with towers that seemed to pierce the low clouds above. It was beautiful, in a haunting way, like a place from an old story where something dreadful had once happened and never quite left. The gardens, once surely magnificent, showed signs of neglect, hedges overgrown, flower beds gone wild, as though no one had cared for them in years. They were shown into a study by a solemn butler named Grimsby, an older man with sharp eyes, and a manner so precise it bordered on unsettling. He informed them that the Duke would not be joining the meeting, that all arrangements would be handled by his solicitor, a thin, quiet man named Mr. Pemberton, who spoke in clipped sentences and seemed eager to finish the business as quickly as possible. The contract was laid out on the desk, and Alara's father signed it with a hand that trembled only slightly. Alara read every line before adding her own signature, noting the terms with a strange, distant clarity. Her family's debts would be cleared entirely. Her sisters would receive dowries sufficient to secure good marriages. In exchange, she would become the Duchess of Ashcombe, bound by law and vow to a man she had never truly met. As they were leaving, Alara paused in the hallway, struck by a strange feeling that she was being watched. She turned and saw, at the far end of the corridor, a door slightly ajar, and through the gap, the edge of a wheeled chair and a hand resting on its arm, still as stone. She could not see his face, only that hand, pale and strong, fingers curled slightly, as though gripping something invisible. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the door closed softly, and the hand was gone. Alara did not mention what she had seen to her father. She climbed back into the carriage in silence, her heart pounding in a way she could not quite explain, half fear and half something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. The wedding day arrived faster than she was prepared for. She stood before the mirror, in her mother's altered gown, watching the maid pin flowers into her hair, and she felt as though she were watching someone else's wedding, someone else's life. Marianne stood beside her, eyes swollen from crying the night before, and squeezed her hand tightly. "You do not have to smile if you do not wish to," Marianne whispered. "I know," Alara said, "but I think I will try anyway. For Father, for us." The ceremony took place in the small chapel at Ashcombe Hall, attended by only a handful of guests, mostly distant relatives of the Duke and a few of Alara's own family. The air inside the chapel was cool and still, thick with the scent of old stone and candle wax. Alara walked down the short aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed forward, refusing to let her hands shake. And then she saw him. Alaric Vane sat near the altar in a polished wooden chair with wheels, dressed in dark formal clothing that fit him with careful precision, as though someone had taken great pains to make certain nothing about his appearance would draw attention to his condition. His hair was dark, just as she remembered from years ago, though threaded now with the faintest hint of gray at the temples, more than his age should allow. His face was sharp and handsome still, but there was a hardness to it, a tightness around his mouth and eyes that spoke of pain, carried too long without release. He did not smile as she approached. He did not frown either. His expression was carefully blank, a mask worn so long it had become a second skin. But his eyes, when they met hers, held something Alara had not expected, a flicker of something raw and unguarded, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, buried again beneath that same cold stillness. The priest spoke the familiar words, and Alara answered when required, her voice steady despite the storm inside her chest. Alaric's voice, when he spoke his own vows, was low and measured. each word given without hesitation, without warmth, but also without cruelty. It was the voice of a man performing a duty, nothing more, nothing less. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, a strange silence fell over the small gathering. There was no cheer, no joyous applause, only the soft rustle of guests shifting in their seats, and the distant call of a bird outside the chapel window. Alaric extended his hand toward her, not to take hers in the traditional way a groom might, but simply as a gesture of acknowledgement, and Alara placed her fingers lightly against his palm. His skin was warm, warmer than she expected, and his grip, brief as it was, held a strength that surprised her. "Alara," he said quietly, testing the sound of her name, as though it were unfamiliar territory. "Welcome to Ashcombe Hall." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, unsure of what else to say. "You may call me Alaric," he said. "There is no need for formality between us now. We are, after all, husband and wife." The words carried no warmth, yet they were not unkind either. Alara studied his face for some sign of what lay beneath the surface, but he had already turned his attention elsewhere, nodding to Grimsby, signaling that the small gathering should proceed to the hall for the modest wedding breakfast that had been arranged. Throughout the meal, Alara observed her new husband from across the table. He spoke little, answering questions from distant relatives, with brief, polite responses, offering nothing more than was required. Yet she noticed small things others might have missed, the way his jaw tightened when someone mentioned the accident, even in passing. The way his hand occasionally pressed flat against his leg beneath the table, as though testing for some sensation that was not there. The way his eyes, when he thought no one was watching, drifted toward the window, toward the gardens beyond, with an expression of such deep longing that it made Alara's chest ache in sympathy for a man she barely knew. By the time the small gathering dispersed and the last of the guests departed, evening had settled over Ashcombe Hall, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. Alara found herself standing alone in the grand entrance hall, uncertain of where to go, uncertain of what was expected of her now that the formalities were complete, and the reality of her new life was about to begin in earnest. Grimsby appeared at her side, his expression unreadable as ever. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," he said, using her new title, with a formality that still felt foreign to her ears. "I will show you to the ducal chambers. His Grace will join you shortly." Alara's heart began to pound as she followed the butler up a wide staircase and down a long corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every step. At the end of the corridor, Grimsby stopped before a set of heavy oak doors and pushed them open, revealing a room far grander than anything Alara had ever seen. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting warm light across furniture upholstered in deep blue velvet. Tall windows overlooked the darkened gardens below, and heavy curtains had been drawn back to let in the last traces of twilight. "His Grace will be along presently," Grimsby said, and then he withdrew, closing the doors softly behind him, leaving Alara alone in the quiet, firelit room. She stood very still, listening to the crackle of the flames, the distant sound of wind against the windows, and the frantic beating of her own heart. She thought of everything that had led her to this moment, the letter that had shaken her father's steady hands, the contract signed in a dim study, the vows spoken in a cold chapel, and now this, the final threshold of her old life crossed, with no way back. Minutes passed, though it felt far longer. Then, from somewhere down the corridor, she heard the soft, steady sound of wheels turning against polished wood, growing closer, until finally, the doors opened once more, and Alaric entered the room alone, wheeling himself with practiced ease, despite the effort it clearly required. He stopped just inside the doorway, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The firelight danced across his face, softening the hard lines she had noticed earlier, revealing instead something almost vulnerable beneath the careful composure he wore like armor. "You are frightened," he said finally, his voice quiet in the stillness of the room. "I am uncertain," Alara replied, choosing her words carefully. "There is a difference." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. A diplomatic answer. "My solicitor tells me you read every line of the contract before signing it. Most brides in your position would have simply trusted their fathers to handle such matters. I did not want to enter this marriage blind," she said, Even if I had no real choice in whether to enter it at all, I could at least understand its terms. A reasonable position, Alaric said, wheeling himself further into the room, closer to the fire, closer to her. I find I respect that more than I expected to. They stood in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them, the weight of the day settling heavily over the room. Alara studied him, searching his face for some clue as to what he truly felt, what he truly wanted from this strange arrangement they had both been forced into by circumstance and duty. I know what is said of me, Alaric said suddenly, his voice low, that I am cold, cruel even. A man broken beyond any hope of mending. I imagine you have heard such things whispered in the corridors of every drawing room you have ever entered. I have heard things, Alara admitted. I do not know yet whether to believe them. Wise, he said. Very wise indeed. He fell silent again, his gaze drifting toward the fire, and Alara watched, as something shifted in his expression, some internal decision being made behind those storm-colored eyes. When he looked back at her, there was a new intensity in his gaze, something fierce and determined that had not been there moments before. There is something I must tell you, he said. Something I have told no one else in this house, not even Grimsby, though I suspect he has guessed more than he lets on. Alara's breath caught in her throat. What is it? Alaric gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles whitening slightly with the pressure. Tonight, he said, you gave me something I did not expect to receive. Not affection, not yet, perhaps never, but a reason. A reason to try again, after 3 years of believing there was no point in trying at all. I do not understand, Alara whispered. Without another word, Alaric began to rise. His movements were slow, deliberate, every muscle straining with visible effort as he pushed himself up from the chair, his hands gripping its arms with white-knuckled determination. Alara watched, frozen, unable to speak, unable even to breathe, as her new husband, the man the entire country believed would never walk again, rose unsteadily to his full height before her, swaying slightly, but standing, truly standing, for the first time in 3 long years. I have been waiting, he said, his voice rough with strain, and something that sounded dangerously close to hope, for a reason to stand again. Tonight, Alara, you gave me one. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating an expression she had not yet seen from him, something raw and unguarded and achingly human, stripped of all the coldness society had layered over him like armor. Alara stood frozen in place, her mind racing to comprehend what she was witnessing, what it meant, what it might cost him, and what it might mean for the strange, uncertain future now stretching out before them both. Outside, the wind picked up against the windows, and somewhere deep in the old house, a door creaked shut, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. For a long moment Alara could not move. She watched him tremble with the effort of holding himself upright, his jaw clenched tight, sweat beating faintly at his temple despite the coolness of the room. Every instinct told her to rush forward, to catch him should he fall, yet something in his eyes warned her against it, a fierce and silent plea not to treat him as fragile, not tonight, not after everything this small act had cost him. How long have you been able to do this? She asked softly, her voice barely more than a breath. A few weeks, he admitted, lowering himself carefully back into the chair, his arms still trembling from the strain. The physicians who examined me after the accident said the injury to my spine was severe but not entirely beyond healing. They gave me little hope, and for a long time, I gave myself even less. I stopped trying. It seemed easier to accept the chair than to fight for something that might never fully return. What changed? Alara asked, moving closer now, drawn by something she could not quite name. Alaric considered the question for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire, as though the flames held the answer he sought.
I am not entirely certain,
he said finally.
Perhaps it was simply time.
Perhaps it was the knowledge that a marriage was coming, that a stranger would soon be living within these walls, and I did not wish to be pitied by a woman I had never met. Whatever the reason, a few months ago, I began to work with a physician in secret. Exercises meant to strengthen what remained functional, to test the limits of what my body could still do. Progress has been slow, painful, but it has been progress. Alara sat down slowly in the chair opposite his, the firelight warm against her skin, and studied the man before her with new eyes. The coldness she had expected, the cruelty whispered about in drawing rooms across the country, none of it matched the exhausted, determined figure sitting before her now. A man who had fought a private battle in silence for months, unwilling to share his hope with anyone, for fear it might be taken from him. "Why tell me this tonight?" she asked. "You could have kept this secret. You could have let me believe, as everyone else does, that you would never walk again. Because you are my wife now," Alaric said simply. "Whatever this marriage is, whatever it becomes, I did not wish to build it upon a foundation of deception. You deserve to know the truth of the man you have bound yourself to, even the parts of that truth I have shown no one else." Something in his honesty struck Alara deeply, and for the first time since receiving the terrible news 3 days earlier, she felt a small flicker of something other than dread settle in her chest. It was not affection, not yet, and certainly not love, but it was respect, and perhaps the faint, fragile beginning of trust. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me." Alaric studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable once more, though something softer lingered at the edges of his eyes. "You are the first person in 3 years who has looked at me without pity," he said. "I find I do not know quite what to make of that." "Perhaps," Alara said, "you simply need time to grow accustomed to it." A faint, genuine smile touched his lips then, the first she had seen from him all day, brief but real, transforming his face in a way that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "Perhaps," he agreed. They talked for a while longer, though the conversation remained careful, both of them testing the boundaries of this strange new arrangement, feeling out what could be said and what should remain unspoken for now. Alaric told her, in careful, measured words, something of the accident itself. A carriage overturned on a rain-slicked road, a broken axle, a fall down a steep embankment that had crushed his lower spine and very nearly ended his life entirely. He did not dwell long on the details, and Alara did not press him, sensing that even this much honesty had cost him more than he let show. In turn, Alara spoke a little of her own life before this marriage, of her mother's death from illness 3 years prior, of her brother lost at sea the following year, of the slow unraveling of her family's fortune that had led, inevitably, to this moment, this room, this uncertain new beginning. Alaric listened with a quiet attentiveness that surprised her, asking gentle questions, offering no false comfort, only genuine interest in understanding the woman circumstance had placed at his side. As the fire burned lower and the night deepened around them, an unspoken agreement seemed to settle between them, neither stated aloud nor formally acknowledged, yet understood all the same. Tonight was about something else entirely, the first careful steps of 2 wounded people beginning, however cautiously, to trust one another. "You should rest," Alaric said eventually, glancing toward the tall windows where the darkness outside had grown complete. "It has been a long day, and I imagine an even longer few days before it." "And you?" Alara asked. "Will you rest as well?" "I find sleep does not come easily to me most nights," he admitted, "but I will retire to my own chamber shortly. There is an adjoining room, connected to these quarters, which I have used since the accident. You need not concern yourself with my comfort." Alara nodded, though something in his words left her with a strange, unexpected pang of disappointment, one she did not fully understand, and chose not to examine too closely. She rose from her chair as Alaric wheeled himself toward the connecting door, pausing there for a moment before looking back at her. "Alara," he said, her name still sounding careful and deliberate on his tongue, as though he were testing its weight. "Whatever this marriage becomes, I promise you this: I will not treat you as a burden, nor as a mere solution to my family's obligations. You saved my family's name from ruin as much as I saved yours. That is not a debt I take lightly." "Nor I," Alara replied. He held her gaze a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them, and then he wheeled himself through the door, leaving her alone once more in the firelit room. Alara stood there for a long while after he had gone, staring into the dying flames, turning over everything that had happened in the space of a single, extraordinary day. She had entered this house expecting a cold, distant stranger, a man broken beyond repair, and instead she had found something far more complicated, a man fighting silently against his own despair, a man who had chosen, for reasons she did not yet fully understand, to let her see the truth of that fight. As she finally prepared for bed, changing into a simple nightgown and letting down her hair, Alara found herself thinking not of the home she had left behind, nor of the uncertain future still stretching ahead of her, but of the image of Alaric rising from his chair, trembling with effort, his eyes fierce with a hope he had kept hidden from the entire world. Whatever else this marriage might become, she understood now that it would not be the simple, loveless arrangement she had braced herself for. Something had shifted tonight, something neither of them could yet name, and as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, Alara could not shake the feeling that her new life at Ashcombe Hall was only just beginning to reveal its secrets, and that many more surprises, some perhaps far less welcome than tonight's revelation, still lay waiting in the shadowed corridors of this ancient, haunted house. Alara woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices somewhere below her window, sharp and urgent, though the words themselves were lost to distance and the thick stone walls of Ashcombe Hall. She rose quickly, wrapped a robe around herself, and crossed to the window overlooking the front drive, where she saw a carriage pulling away at speed, its wheels throwing up gravel in its haste. A man stood watching it go, his back to the house, his posture rigid with anger. When he finally turned, catching sight of her silhouette in the window above, he offered a stiff, formal bow before disappearing back inside. She did not know him, but something about the encounter left her uneasy, a feeling she could not quite shake as she dressed for the day, with the help of a young maid named Effie, a cheerful girl with quick hands and quicker eyes, who seemed eager to share the gossip of the household with her new mistress. "That was Master Edmund, Your Grace," Effie said, tucking a final pin into Alara's hair. "The Duke's cousin. He arrived late last night, before the wedding breakfast even finished, demanding to see his Grace. Grimsby wouldn't let him pass the study door, not with the family occupied elsewhere, and there was quite a row about it, though I only heard bits through the kitchen stairs." "What did he want?" Alara asked, though she suspected she already knew, at least in part. Effie glanced toward the door, lowering her voice, as though the walls themselves might carry tales. "Money, most like, Your Grace. Master Edmund always wants money. He's next in line for the title, you see, seeing as his Grace has no children and was thought unlikely ever to have any, given his condition. Master Edmund has been living rather comfortably on that expectation for some years now, borrowing against a future that isn't quite his yet. I imagine your marriage has put a fair fright into him." Alara considered this new information carefully as she made her way downstairs, her mind turning over the implications. If Edmund Vane stood to inherit everything, should Alaric remain without an heir, then her marriage, and any children that might one day come from it, represented a direct threat to his expectations. It was hardly proof of anything sinister. Families quarreled over inheritance constantly, yet combined with the strange, angry scene she had witnessed that morning, it left a small seed of unease planted firmly in her thoughts. She found Alaric in the breakfast room, already seated at the table, a plate of food largely untouched before him, as he read through a stack of correspondence with a furrowed brow. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression softened, though the tension around his eyes did not fully disappear. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well, despite the early disturbance." "You heard it too then," Alara said, taking the seat across from him. "The entire household heard it, I imagine. My cousin has never possessed the gift of subtlety." Alaric set down the letter he had been reading, rubbing at his temple, as though warding off the beginnings of a headache. "I apologize if he disturbed your rest. Edmund has a habit of arriving unannounced whenever he requires funds, and our marriage yesterday has apparently accelerated his usual schedule considerably." "Effie mentioned he stands to inherit the title," Alara said carefully, watching Alaric's face for his reaction. "He does, or rather, he did, before yesterday. As my closest living male relative, Edmund has spent the better part of 3 years operating under the assumption that my condition would prevent me from ever producing an heir of my own. He has borrowed heavily against that assumption, and my marriage to you represents, in his eyes, a considerable threat to his creditors' patience with him." Alaric's voice carried a weary edge, the tone of a man who had fought this particular battle many times before. "I do not believe he means genuine harm, whatever his faults. He is reckless and self-interested, certainly, But not, I think, dangerous. Ilara nodded, though privately she was not entirely convinced, and something in the careful way Alaric spoke made her wonder if he believed his own reassurance completely, or if he simply wished to. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Grimsby, who entered with a stiff, apologetic bearing that immediately drew both their attention. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Alaric, "Dr. Bramwell has sent word that he will be unable to continue his weekly visits, effective immediately. He offers no explanation beyond a sudden and pressing engagement elsewhere." Alaric's expression shifted, something dark and controlled passing across his features before he mastered it once more. "Dr. Bramwell has attended me faithfully for over a year without complaint," he said slowly. "This is rather sudden." "Indeed, Your Grace. I took the liberty of inquiring further, but the messenger who delivered the note knew nothing beyond its contents." Alaric was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, and Ilara found herself studying him closely, sensing that this news troubled him far more than his outward composure suggested. When Grimsby had withdrawn, she leaned forward slightly, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "Who is Dr. Bramwell?" she asked. Alaric hesitated, and for a moment, she thought he might deflect the question entirely, retreating back behind the careful walls he had shown her only glimpses beyond the previous night. But then he seemed to reach some internal decision, and he met her gaze directly. "He is the physician who has been assisting me with the exercises I mentioned to you last night," Alaric said. "The one working to help restore what movement remains possible in my legs. His sudden departure, without warning, without even the courtesy of a proper explanation, is troubling. He has never given any indication of dissatisfaction with our arrangement, nor any pressing reason to abandon it so abruptly." "Do you think Edmund had something to do with it?" Ilara asked, the question slipping out before she could fully consider whether it was wise to voice it aloud. Alaric's eyes sharpened. "It is a reasonable suspicion, though I have no proof of it. Edmund has certainly made his objections to my recovery known before. In careless comments, he perhaps believed I did not fully understand the weight of. He once remarked, rather bitterly, that it would be a great inconvenience to certain parties should I ever walk unassisted again. I dismissed it at the time as simple resentment. Now I find myself less certain." The unease that had settled over Ilara that morning deepened considerably. She thought of the angry voices before dawn, of Edmund's stiff, resentful bow beneath her window, of the physician's sudden and unexplained departure, and a cold, uncomfortable feeling took root in her chest. A sense that the walls of Ashcombe Hall held more danger within them than the simple loneliness and coldness she had originally feared. "We will need to find another physician," she said finally, choosing to focus on what could be practically addressed, rather than the darker suspicions swirling beneath the surface. "One who cannot be so easily frightened away." Something in her tone, calm and determined, drew a small, surprised smile from Alaric, the tightness around his eyes easing slightly. "You speak as though this is now your concern as much as mine," he observed. "Is it not?" Ilara asked. "You said yourself last night that whatever this marriage becomes, it would not be built upon deception, nor treated as a mere arrangement of convenience. If that is true, then your recovery, and whatever threatens it, concerns me as much as anything else within these walls." Alaric studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his storm-colored eyes, and then he nodded slowly. "Very well, Duchess. Then let us find you a task worthy of your determination. I know of a physician in the nearest town, a younger man named Dr. Ellery Finch, who trained under a specialist in spinal injuries before setting up his own practice. I had considered consulting him previously, before Bramwell's services proved sufficient. Perhaps now is the time to send for him." Over the following days, Ilara found herself drawn increasingly into the rhythms of her new life at Ashcombe Hall, exploring the vast house room by room, learning the names and faces of the staff who kept it running, and slowly, carefully, building something with Alaric that felt less like the cold arrangement she had originally dreaded, and more like a genuine, if cautious, partnership. She wrote to Dr. Finch personally, arranging his first visit, and accompanied Alaric to the specially prepared room where his exercises took place, a modest chamber on the ground floor, fitted with parallel bars and padded mats, hidden away from the prying eyes of visitors and staff alike. Yet beneath the fragile new warmth growing between them, the unease from that first morning never fully faded. Letters occasionally went missing, before reaching their intended recipients. A servant reported seeing an unfamiliar figure near the stables late one evening, gone before anyone could properly identify him. And Edmund Vane, though he did not return to the house again in those first days, seemed to hover at the edges of every conversation among the staff, his name spoken always with a mixture of pity and wariness that suggested Ilara was not the only one who sensed something troubling in his sudden, angry visit. One afternoon, exploring a rarely used wing of the house on her own, Ilara discovered a locked door at the end of a narrow corridor, tucked away behind a heavy curtain that seemed designed to discourage exactly the kind of curiosity she now felt. She tried the handle out of simple idle interest, expecting it to yield nothing, and was surprised when Grimsby appeared, seemingly from nowhere behind her, his expression carefully neutral. "That room has remained locked since the accident, Your Grace," he said. "It was His Grace's private study, before the carriage overturned. He has not entered it since, nor permitted anyone else to do so." "Why not?" Ilara asked, curiosity overtaking her caution. Grimsby's expression flickered, something like old grief, passing briefly across his weathered features. "I could not say for certain, Your Grace. Perhaps it holds memories he is not yet ready to face. The accident occurred not long after he departed that very room, on his way to a meeting he had scheduled rather suddenly, late in the evening, with a solicitor whose name he never shared with the household staff." Something in the butler's careful phrasing caught Ilara's attention immediately. "A meeting he scheduled suddenly? Do you know what it concerned?" "I do not, Your Grace," Grimsby said, though something in his tone suggested he had his own private suspicions he was not yet prepared to voice. "Though I have often wondered, in the years since, whether that meeting, and the accident which followed it, were entirely unconnected, as the official reports concluded them to be." The words hung in the quiet corridor between them, heavy with implication, and Ilara felt the small, cold seed of unease, planted that first morning, grow suddenly, sharply larger. She thanked Grimsby for his candor, and continued on her way, but the conversation stayed with her for the remainder of the day, turning over and over in her mind, as she tried to piece together the fragments of a mystery she had not expected to find waiting for her within the walls of her new home. That evening, as she and Alaric sat together in the drawing room, the fire crackling low and warm between them, Ilara found herself studying her husband with new eyes, wondering how much he himself understood about the true circumstances surrounding his accident, and how much remained hidden even from him, buried beneath 3 years of careful silence and unanswered questions that no one within Ashcombe Hall seemed quite willing to voice aloud. Dr. Ellery Finch arrived 3 days later, a slight, energetic man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and in manner of speaking so rapid that Ilara found herself struggling to follow his explanations at first. He examined Alaric thoroughly in the small exercise chamber, testing reflexes, measuring the strength remaining in each limb, asking a steady stream of questions that Alaric answered with the patient weariness of a man who had endured such examinations many times before. "The previous notes left by Dr. Bramwell are quite thorough," Finch said finally, setting down his instruments and studying Alaric with genuine interest rather than the pity that so often colored the expressions of those who encountered the Duke's condition. "Your progress over the past several months is remarkable, Your Grace. Truly remarkable. Most physicians would not have believed such recovery possible, given the severity of the original injury as described here. And yet you sound surprised rather than pleased," Alaric observed dryly. "Surprised, yes, but pleased as well," Finch said, adjusting his spectacles. "I simply find myself curious why Dr. Bramwell abandoned such a promising case so abruptly. It is not the behavior I would expect from a physician invested in his patient's recovery, and from what I have heard of the man's reputation, he was not known for taking his responsibilities lightly." Ilara, standing quietly near the door, exchanged a glance with Alaric, both of them thinking, she suspected, of the same unspoken possibility neither had yet voiced openly to this new physician. Finch, perhaps sensing the tension in the room, did not press the question further, instead turning his attention to outlining a revised program of exercises designed to build upon the progress already made. Over the following weeks, a new rhythm settled over Ashcombe Hall. Each morning, Ilara accompanied Alaric to the exercise chamber, watching as Finch guided him through a careful sequence of movements designed to strengthen muscles weakened by years of disuse. At first, she remained a quiet observer, but gradually, at Alaric's own invitation, she began to assist directly, steadying him during the more difficult exercises, offering an arm to lean on when his strength faltered, celebrating quietly with him each small victory, each additional moment he could stand unassisted, each additional step achieved along the parallel bars that had become the center of his daily struggle. Their conversations during these sessions grew easier with each passing day, the careful formality of their first meeting gradually giving way to something warmer, more genuine. Alaric spoke of his childhood at Ashcombe Hall, of a father who had been distant and demanding, of a mother who had died when he was young, leaving him to navigate the complicated expectations of his title largely alone. Alara, in turn, shared memories of her own family, of afternoons spent reading beneath the old oak tree at her childhood home, of her brother's laughter before the sea claimed him, of her mother's gentle wisdom before illness took her too soon. "You have lost as much as I have," Alaric observed one afternoon, pausing between exercises, sweat beading at his temple from the effort of the session. "Perhaps more, and yet you do not carry it the way I have carried my own losses, like a weight dragging you constantly downward." "I have simply had longer to learn how to carry it differently," Alara said. "Grief does not disappear, I think. It only changes shape over time, becomes something you can hold without it crushing you entirely." Alaric considered this in silence for a long moment, his eyes distant, and Alara wondered if he was thinking of his own grief, the loss of his mobility, the isolation of 3 years spent largely alone within these walls, cut off from the world that had once welcomed him so easily. "Perhaps," he said finally, "you might teach me how to do the same." It was during one such quiet afternoon, weeks into their new arrangement, that Alara finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her since her conversation with Grimsby in the locked corridor. They sat together in the drawing room afterward, both tired from the exercise session, but comfortable in a way that had become increasingly familiar between them. "Grimsby told me something troubling," she began carefully, watching Alaric's face for his reaction. "About the night of your accident. He said you had scheduled a sudden meeting with a solicitor, whose identity you never shared with the household." Alaric went very still, the warmth that had been building between them over the preceding weeks, suddenly shadowed by something darker, more guarded. "He should not have spoken of that," he said finally, his voice careful, controlled. "Is it true?" Alara pressed gently. "Was there such a meeting?" A long silence stretched between them, before Alaric finally answered, his voice low and heavy with old, unresolved pain. "There was," he admitted. "I received a letter that evening, unsigned, suggesting certain irregularities in the management of my late father's estate. Irregularities that implicated someone close to the family. I scheduled an urgent meeting to investigate the claims further, intending to travel to meet with a solicitor in town who could advise me on how to proceed. The carriage overturned on the road less than an hour after I departed. I never reached that meeting, and I never learned who had sent the letter, nor what irregularities it referred to." Alara felt a chill settle over her, despite the warmth of the fire nearby. "You believe the accident was not simply an accident," she said slowly, understanding now the source of the doubt she had sensed in Grimsby's careful words. "I did, for a time," Alaric admitted. "In the immediate aftermath, when the pain was sharpest and my anger at the unfairness of it all burned hottest, I convinced myself that someone had arranged the accident deliberately, to prevent me from uncovering whatever the letter had hinted at. But the investigating magistrate found no evidence of foul play, only a broken axle and a rain-slicked road, and eventually, I convinced myself that grief and anger had led me to imagine conspiracies where none truly existed. It seemed easier, in some ways, to accept a random tragedy than to believe someone I knew had wished me such harm." "And now?" Alara asked quietly. "With Dr. Bramwell's sudden departure, with Edmund's strange behavior, do you still believe it was simply an accident?" Alaric met her gaze directly, and in his eyes, she saw the same unease that had been growing within her own thoughts for weeks now, finally given voice between them. "I do not know," he said honestly, "but I find myself increasingly unwilling to dismiss the possibility entirely, particularly now that I have something, someone, worth protecting, from whatever truth that letter might have contained." The words settled between them with quiet weight, and Alara understood, without either of them needing to say it aloud, that they had crossed some invisible threshold in their strange, evolving partnership. Whatever had happened 3 years ago, whatever secrets still lurked within the walls of Ashcombe Hall and the tangled branches of the Vane family, they would face it now together, rather than each carrying the burden of suspicion alone. That night, after Alaric had retired to his own chamber, Alara sat by her window once more, watching the moon rise over the neglected gardens below, and found herself thinking not of the fear and uncertainty that had accompanied her here weeks earlier, but of something new, something that felt dangerously close to purpose, perhaps even to hope. Whatever darkness lingered in this house's past, whatever danger still moved unseen through its shadowed corridors, she no longer felt entirely alone in facing it. And for a woman who had lost so much in so short a time, that realization alone felt like the first true gift her strange, unexpected marriage had given her. Yet even as that fragile hope settled over her, a small, persistent worry remained, coiled tight beneath her thoughts like a serpent waiting to strike. If someone truly had arranged the carriage accident 3 years ago to silence whatever truth Alaric had been on his way to uncover, then that same danger had not necessarily disappeared, simply because 3 years had passed in relative quiet. If anything, Alaric's slow, secret recovery, and now his marriage, threatened to disturb whatever fragile peace had settled over Ashcombe Hall since that terrible night, and Alara could not shake the growing certainty that whoever had once tried to silence her husband might soon feel compelled to try again. The following morning brought a discovery that turned Alara's quiet suspicions into something far more urgent. She had risen early, as had become her habit, intending to walk the gardens before the household stirred fully to life. The air was crisp and cool, mist still clinging to the overgrown hedges, and she found herself drawn toward the old stable block at the edge of the grounds, curious to see the horses she had heard whinnying softly each morning from her window. A young stable hand named Tobias, no older than 16, greeted her with a nervous bow, clearly unaccustomed to receiving visits from the new Duchess. As she admired the horses, making idle conversation to put the boy at ease, he mentioned, almost in passing, something that made her blood run cold. "Funny thing, Your Grace," Tobias said, brushing down a chestnut mare with practiced strokes. "Old Fenwick, he was head groom here before the accident. He always said the axle on that carriage weren't right the week before it broke. Said someone had been at it in the night, though he never could prove nothing, and the magistrate wouldn't hear of it once his Grace's own physicians said it were an accident, plain and simple. Fenwick got let go not long after, mind you, for drinking too much, they said, though he swore up and down he'd never touched a drop the week he made that claim." "Where is Fenwick now?" Alara asked, her heart pounding. "Living in the village still, Your Grace, in a small cottage near the old mill. Keeps mostly to himself these days." Alara thanked the boy and returned to the house immediately, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just learned. If the axle had truly been tampered with, and if a witness to that tampering had been dismissed and discredited shortly afterward, then the accident that had cost Alaric 3 years of his mobility, and nearly his life, had been no accident at all, but a deliberate act, carefully arranged and carefully concealed by someone within the household, or close enough to it, to access the carriage the night before Alaric's fateful journey. She found Alaric in his study, going over estate accounts with the careful diligence he applied to every aspect of his responsibilities, and relayed what she had learned as calmly as she could manage, though her voice trembled slightly with the weight of the revelation. Alaric set down his pen slowly, his face draining of color as he absorbed her words. "Fenwick," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I remember him. A good man, loyal to my father before me. I never thought to question his dismissal at the time. I was too consumed with my own pain to notice much of anything happening around me in those first months. We should speak with him," Alara said. "If he witnessed something, if he can tell us more about what he saw that night, it might help us understand who was truly responsible. It might also place him in danger, if whoever arranged this discovers we have reopened old questions," Alaric said, his tone careful, cautious. "And it would place you in danger as well, Alara, should this prove to be more than idle suspicion. I do not wish to draw you further into a danger that was never meant to touch you." "It touches me regardless," Alara said firmly. "I am your wife now, Whatever the circumstances that brought us together, your danger is my danger. I will not simply retreat to safety while you face this alone." Something in her determined expression seemed to settle whatever internal argument Alaric had been having with himself, and he nodded slowly, a mixture of gratitude and reluctant acceptance passing across his features. "Very well," he said. "We will visit Fenwick together, quietly, without drawing unnecessary attention to our purpose. But Alara, I must ask you to exercise great caution in the days ahead. If someone did indeed arrange my accident 3 years ago, and if that same person now senses their handiwork beginning to unravel, they may prove willing to take drastic measures to protect whatever secret they have kept hidden all this time." They arranged their visit to the village for the following afternoon, traveling in a plain carriage without the ducal crest displayed, hoping to avoid drawing attention to their errand. Fenwick's cottage proved a modest but well-kept dwelling near the old mill, and the man himself, when he answered their knock, looked older than his years, his face weathered by hardship and worry in equal measure. Recognition dawned slowly in his eyes as he took in Alaric's face, and something like fear flickered across his features before he composed himself and invited them inside. "I wondered if this day might come," Fenwick said, once they were seated by his modest hearth, a cup of weak tea offered with trembling hands. "I've kept my silence 3 years now, Your Grace, out of fear more than loyalty, I'm ashamed to admit. But if you've come asking, I suppose you already suspect the truth of what happened." "Tell us what you saw," Alaric said, his voice gentle, despite the tension evident in his rigid posture. Fenwick took a long breath before beginning. "It were late, the night before your accident, Your Grace. I couldn't sleep, my old bones aching something fierce, so I went down to check on the horses, quiet-like, not wanting to wake the household. I saw a light in the carriage house, where it shouldn't have been at that hour, and when I looked closer, I saw someone working at the underside of your carriage, the good one you always took for important journeys. I couldn't see his face clear in the dark, but I recognized his build, and I recognized the way he moved. It were Jenkins, Your Grace, the estate manager your father hired years back, still working under you at the time." Alara felt Alaric go very still beside her. "Jenkins," he repeated slowly. "He managed the estate accounts. He had access to every part of this household, every carriage, every document." "Aye, Your Grace, that he did," Fenwick continued. "I thought perhaps he were simply making repairs, tending to some fault he'd noticed, and I thought no more of it until the accident happened the very next evening. When I finally worked up the courage to mention what I'd seen to the magistrate, I found myself dismissed within the week, my character questioned, my word discredited, before I'd hardly finished speaking it. Jenkins himself left the estate not long after, moved on to some other position, or so I heard, though I never learned exactly where he went." "Do you know where he might be found now?" Alara asked. Fenwick shook his head slowly. "I heard rumors, Your Grace, that he'd taken up a comfortable position somewhere in the city, funded rather better than an estate manager's usual wages might explain. But rumors are all I have, I'm afraid. I've kept my distance from such questions ever since, for my own safety and my family's." They thanked Fenwick for his honesty, and Alaric pressed a generous sum of money into the old man's hands before they departed, a gesture of gratitude and perhaps also of guilt for the years of silent fear the man had endured on his behalf. As their carriage made its way back toward Ashcombe Hall, both of them sat in heavy silence, absorbing the weight of what they had just learned. "Jenkins worked closely with my father before his death," Alaric said finally, staring out the carriage window at the passing countryside without truly seeing it. "And with Edmund, on occasion, when matters of the estate required consultation with the family's other branches, it would not have been difficult for someone to have influenced him, or paid him, to arrange what happened that night." "Do you think Edmund was responsible?" Alara asked quietly. "I do not know," Alaric admitted. "Edmund is reckless and self-interested, certainly, and he stood to gain everything, had I died that night, or even had I simply remained permanently unable to produce an heir. But arranging such a thing, ensuring Jenkins's cooperation, silencing Fenwick's testimony afterward, it suggests a level of careful planning that does not entirely match the impulsive, careless man I have always known my cousin to be. I fear there may be another hand guiding these events, someone with both the patience and the resources to arrange such a thing, and to ensure it remained concealed for 3 long years. The unease that had been steadily building within Alara since her first morning at Ashcombe Hall now settled into something far more concrete, far more frightening. Whatever conspiracy had cost Alaric his mobility and nearly his life 3 years ago remained unresolved. Its architect still unidentified, still potentially watching, still potentially willing to act again should the truth draw too close to the surface. As their carriage passed through the iron gates of Ashcombe Hall once more, Alara found herself glancing at the shadowed windows and darkened corners of the great house with new wariness, wondering how many secrets still lingered within its walls, and how much danger truly remained hidden behind its ancient stones. That evening, as they sat together in the drawing room, both still absorbing the weight of Fenwick's testimony, Grimsby entered with an expression more troubled than Alara had yet seen from the normally composed butler. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Alaric directly, "a letter has arrived, forwarded from London. I believe you will wish to read it immediately." Alaric took the letter with visibly steady hands, though Alara could sense the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and read in silence for a long moment, before his expression shifted into something Alara had not yet seen from him, a complicated mixture of old pain and fresh apprehension. "It seems," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "that we are soon to have a visitor. Lady Priscilla Ashworth writes to inform me of her intention to call upon Ashcombe Hall within the fortnight, expressing her sincere wish to reconnect following news of my recent marriage, and offering her congratulations in person." The name meant nothing to Alara, yet something in the way Alaric spoke it, careful and guarded, told her immediately that this Lady Priscilla represented a chapter of his past he had not yet shared with her, and that her impending arrival threatened to complicate their already precarious circumstances considerably further. "Who is she?" Alara asked, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest. Alaric folded the letter slowly, setting it aside on the small table beside his chair, and for a moment he seemed to be choosing his words with great care. "Priscilla and I were engaged once," he said finally, "many years before the accident, before I even inherited the title. We were young, and I believed myself deeply in love with her, foolish as that now seems. She ended the engagement rather abruptly when a wealthier suitor presented himself, a merchant's son with a fortune considerably larger than what I could offer her at the time, before my father's death placed the dukedom in my hands. I have not seen her since, though I heard, some years later, that her marriage brought her considerable status but little genuine happiness. And now she wishes to visit," Alara said slowly, "just as news of your recovery and your marriage has reached London society." "Yes," Alaric said, meeting her gaze directly, something apologetic in his expression. "I confess the timing troubles me as much as it seems to trouble you. Priscilla was never a woman who did anything without careful calculation of her own advantage. I cannot imagine what she hopes to gain from renewing our acquaintance now, but I doubt very much it stems from simple sentiment or genuine goodwill." Alara considered this new information carefully, turning it over alongside everything else they had learned that day: the tampered carriage axle, Fenwick's fearful testimony, the mysterious estate manager who had vanished into a suspiciously comfortable position somewhere in the city, a woman scorned by circumstance, now widowed or unhappily married, arriving with careful timing just as Alaric's fortunes began to improve considerably, struck Alara as far too convenient a coincidence to dismiss entirely. "Do you think she could be connected to what happened to you?" Alara asked, voicing the suspicion that had been forming steadily in her mind. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously rather than dismissing it outright. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "Priscilla was ambitious, certainly, and not above manipulating circumstances to her own advantage when the opportunity presented itself. But arranging something as elaborate and dangerous as what Fenwick described seems beyond even her considerable capacity for self-interest, or so I would have believed before today. Perhaps it is time we approached her visit with rather more caution than simple courtesy would normally demand." They spent the remainder of the evening discussing how best to prepare for Priscilla's impending arrival, and Alara found herself grateful, in a strange way, for the shared purpose that had grown between them over these past weeks. What had begun as a cold, dutiful arrangement, forced upon them both by circumstance, had transformed, gradually and almost without her noticing, into something that felt increasingly like genuine partnership, perhaps even the early beginnings of something deeper still. Later that night, unable to settle into sleep with so many troubling thoughts still circling through her mind, Ilara wandered down to the small library on the ground floor, hoping a book might help quiet her racing thoughts enough to allow rest. She found Alaric already there, seated by the low fire, a book open on his lap, though his eyes remained fixed on the flames rather than the page before him. "I could not sleep either," he said, glancing up as she entered, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. "Too much to think about," Ilara agreed, settling into the chair across from him without needing to be invited, a familiarity that had grown naturally between them over the preceding weeks. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly, before Alaric finally spoke again, his voice quieter, more vulnerable than she had heard it in some time. "I find myself grateful," he said, "for your presence through all of this. I had grown so accustomed to facing everything alone these past 3 years, the pain, the isolation, the slow, private battle to reclaim even a fraction of what the accident had taken from me. I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to have someone beside me, truly beside me, rather than simply pitying me from a careful distance." "You are not alone now," Ilara said softly, and she meant it with a sincerity that surprised even herself, given how recently this marriage had been forced upon them both, by circumstances neither had chosen. Alaric reached out then, his hand covering hers where it rested on the arm of her chair, a simple gesture, yet one that sent a warmth spreading through her chest unlike anything she had felt in this house before. "No," he agreed quietly, "I am not alone. And for that, Ilara, whatever else this strange marriage of ours has brought us, I find myself more grateful than I know how to properly express." They remained there together for a long while, the fire burning low, the weight of the day's troubling discoveries momentarily eased by the quiet comfort of shared company. Yet even as Ilara finally rose to retire for the night, Alaric's hand lingering briefly in hers before releasing it, she could not entirely shake the persistent unease that had settled over her since Fenwick's fearful testimony that afternoon. Somewhere beyond the walls of Ashcombe Hall, whoever had arranged Alaric's accident 3 years ago remained free, unpunished, and now, with Priscilla's suspiciously timed letter freshly delivered, Ilara found herself wondering with growing dread whether the danger that had nearly claimed her husband's life once before might soon be circling closer than either of them yet realized. The following days passed in a strange, uneasy calm, the household preparing for Priscilla's arrival, even as Ilara and Alaric continued their quiet investigation into Jenkins's whereabouts and the true nature of the conspiracy that had cost Alaric so much. Grimsby, proving himself an unexpectedly valuable ally, once his initial reticence had been overcome, made discreet inquiries among his own network of contacts, in service to other great houses, seeking any word of the missing estate manager's current situation. Dr. Finch continued Alaric's exercises with steady, encouraging progress, and Ilara found herself increasingly drawn into the rhythm of a life she had never expected to want, filled with purpose, with growing affection, and with a shared determination to uncover the truth that had haunted this house for 3 long years. Yet beneath the fragile peace of those quiet days, a persistent sense of foreboding lingered, the awareness that whatever secrets Ashcombe Hall still held, whatever danger remained coiled unseen within its shadowed history, would not remain buried forever. And as the day of Priscilla's arrival drew steadily closer, Ilara found herself bracing for whatever storm that visit might bring, sensing with growing certainty that the answers they sought, and the dangers they had not yet fully anticipated, were about to converge upon Ashcombe Hall with far greater force than either she or Alaric had yet prepared themselves to face. Lady Priscilla Ashworth arrived at Ashcombe Hall on a bright, deceptively cheerful afternoon, her carriage far grander than the modest one Ilara and Alaric had used for their visit to Fenwick's cottage, drawn by 4 matched horses and trimmed with silver fittings that caught the sunlight with ostentatious brilliance. Ilara watched from the drawing-room window as Priscilla descended, immediately struck by the woman's striking beauty, golden hair arranged in elaborate curls beneath a fashionable bonnet, a gown of deep emerald silk that fit her figure with expensive precision. "She has not changed at all," Alaric murmured beside her, his tone carefully neutral, though Ilara sensed the old tension coiled beneath his composed exterior. They received their guest in the main drawing room, Grimsby announcing her arrival with the same stiff formality he applied to every visitor. Though Alara noticed his eyes lingered on Priscilla, with something that might have been wariness. An impression she filed away for later consideration. Priscilla swept into the room with practiced grace, her expression arranging itself into a picture of warm delight as her gaze fell upon Alaric. "Alaric," she said, her voice carrying a musical lightness that seemed almost too perfectly calculated. "How wonderful to see you again, and looking so well. The rumors of your recovery hardly did justice to what I see before me now." "Priscilla," Alaric replied, his tone polite but carefully guarded. "May I present my wife, the Duchess of Ashcombe?" Priscilla turned her attention to Alara then, her smile widening, though something calculating flickered briefly behind her pale blue eyes before being smoothly concealed once more. "My dear Duchess," she said, extending a gloved hand. "What a fortunate woman you are. I confess I hardly recognized dear Alaric from the reports I had heard." "There is no secret," Alara said evenly, accepting the offered hand with careful politeness. "Only patience, and the excellent care of a skilled physician." "How modest you are," Priscilla said, her tone light, but her eyes assessing, cataloging every detail of Alara's appearance and manner with an intensity that felt distinctly uncomfortable. "I do hope we might become great friends, given the circumstances. Alaric and I share such a long history together, after all, and I would hate for that history to create any awkwardness between us." The conversation continued in this manner for some time, Priscilla's words always polished and pleasant on their surface, yet carrying an undertone that left Alara feeling as though every remark concealed some deeper, less charitable intention. She spoke at length of her own circumstances, revealing that her husband had passed away some 18 months prior, leaving her with a title but considerably less fortune than society had assumed her marriage would secure, her late husband's business ventures having proven far less sound than his reputation suggested. "I find myself in rather reduced circumstances," Priscilla admitted at one point, though something in her tone suggested this confession was calculated, rather than genuinely vulnerable. "It is remarkable how quickly society's warmth cools, once one's fortune diminishes. I have been forced to reconsider a great many old acquaintances in recent months, wondering which among them might still value my company for its own sake, rather than for whatever advantage it once offered them." Alara noted the careful way Priscilla's gaze drifted toward Alaric as she spoke these words, and something cold settled in her chest, a growing certainty that this visit represented far more than simple nostalgia or genuine goodwill. A woman recently widowed, her fortune diminished, arriving with suspicious timing, just as her former fiancé's health and prospects had dramatically improved, struck Alara as precisely the sort of calculated opportunity a woman like Priscilla would not easily allow to pass unexploited. When Priscilla finally departed some hours later, having accepted an invitation to return the following week for a longer stay, a suggestion Alara suspected she had engineered herself despite the polite fiction of having been invited, Alara found herself alone with Alaric once more, both of them visibly relieved by their guest's departure. "She has not changed," Alaric said again, more firmly this time, except perhaps to become even more skilled at concealing her true intentions behind pleasant conversation. "You believe she seeks to renew your former engagement," Alara said, though it was not truly a question. "I believe she seeks whatever advantage might be available to her, whether that involves renewing old affections, or something else entirely that I have not yet fully considered," Alaric replied. Priscilla was never a woman driven by sentiment, whatever she might claim otherwise. I would be a fool to underestimate her capacity for calculated pursuit of her own interests, particularly now that her circumstances have grown considerably more desperate than they once were. Alara considered this carefully, turning over the implications of Priscilla's diminished fortune, alongside everything else they had learned in recent weeks. A woman in need of funds, with a history connected to Alaric's family, arriving suspiciously soon after news of his recovery had begun to circulate through society, seemed to fit rather too neatly alongside the unresolved mystery of Jenkins's tampering and Edmund's suspicious debts. "Do you think she and Edmund might be acquainted?" Alara asked slowly, the question forming itself even as she spoke it aloud. Alaric's expression sharpened with sudden consideration. I had not thought to connect them, he admitted, but it is not an unreasonable question. Edmund moves in similar social circles, and Priscilla, in her reduced circumstances, might well have sought connections among those with expectations of inheritance, however uncertain those expectations might currently be. The seed of suspicion, once planted, grew quickly between them, and over the following days, Alara found herself watching for any sign of connection between their two potential adversaries, however circumstantial such evidence might initially prove. Grimsby, continuing his discreet inquiries on their behalf, eventually returned with a piece of information that confirmed their growing suspicions considerably. I have learned, Your Grace, he reported quietly one evening, that Lady Priscilla and Master Edmund have been seen together on several occasions in London, at gatherings not typically frequented by either of their usual social circles. My contact, a footman in service to a mutual acquaintance, described their manner together as considerably more familiar than mere passing acquaintance would suggest. This confirmation settled heavily over both Alara and Alaric, transforming their vague suspicions into something considerably more concrete and troubling. If Priscilla and Edmund were indeed connected, working together toward some shared purpose, then Priscilla's sudden reappearance in Alaric's life, timed so precisely alongside his improving health and their recent marriage, suggested a coordinated effort rather than simple coincidence, one that likely extended back to the original conspiracy that had cost Alaric his mobility 3 years earlier. We must proceed carefully, Alaric said, his expression grim with the weight of this new understanding. If they are indeed working together, and if they were responsible, in whole or in part, for what happened to me 3 years ago, then our continued investigation places us both in considerably greater danger than we had initially anticipated. We cannot afford to alert them to our suspicions before we have gathered sufficient proof to expose them definitively. Despite the growing danger, or perhaps because of it, Alara found her bond with Alaric deepening steadily in the days that followed, forged by shared purpose and mutual reliance in the face of uncertain threat. They took to walking together in the neglected gardens each evening, Alaric's steps growing steadily stronger with each passing week of careful exercise, and Alara found herself falling into an easy companionship with him that felt increasingly like genuine affection rather than the dutiful courtesy their arrangement had originally demanded. One evening, as they paused beside an overgrown rose bed that had once, judging by its remaining structure, been the pride of the estate's gardens, Alaric reached out and gently touched a wilted bloom still clinging stubbornly to its thorny stem. My mother planted these, he said quietly, before she died. I have not had the heart to restore this garden properly since, though I have often thought it deserved better care than neglect. Perhaps, Alara said carefully, it might be restored now. A new beginning, of sorts, for a garden that has waited long enough for someone to tend it again. Alaric turned to look at her then, something warm and unguarded in his expression that made her breath catch unexpectedly. I would like that, he said softly. Very much. In fact, if you would help me undertake it. I would like nothing more, Alara replied, and the words felt more true than she had expected them to, a genuine desire rather than simple politeness. They stood together in the fading evening light, the weight of the danger still gathering around them, momentarily forgotten in the quiet intimacy of that shared moment, and Alara felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Hall, a flicker of genuine hope that whatever darkness still threatened them, whatever conspiracy still lurked unresolved in the shadows of this ancient house, she and Alaric might yet face it together and emerge, eventually, into something resembling the happiness neither of them had truly expected this strange, forced marriage to ever provide. That fragile hope, however, was to be tested sooner than either of them anticipated. 2 nights later, as Alaric completed his evening exercises in the small chamber that had become the private center of his slow recovery, a sudden crack echoed through the room, sharp and violent, followed immediately by a cry of pain that sent Alara rushing from the adjoining hallway where she had been waiting. She found Alaric on the floor beside the parallel bars, his face twisted with pain, one of the wooden supports splintered and broken beside him, where it had given way beneath his weight without warning. Alaric, she cried, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands moving frantically over him, searching for the source of his obvious pain. "My arm," he gasped, his face pale with the effort of controlling his reaction to the sudden agony. "I do not believe anything is broken, but the fall was considerable." Dr. Finch arrived within the hour, summoned urgently from his lodgings in the village, and after a careful examination, declared that Alaric had indeed avoided any broken bones, though severe bruising and strained muscles would require several days of careful rest before he could safely resume his exercises. But it was his examination of the broken support bar itself that sent a fresh chill through Alara's chest, confirming the suspicion that had already begun forming in her mind the moment she heard that violent crack echo through the exercise chamber. "This was not simple wear," Finch said grimly, holding up the splintered wood for both of them to examine. "See here, along the break itself, the wood has been deliberately weakened, sawn partway through, and then concealed with a thin layer of fresh varnish to disguise the damage from casual inspection. Someone wished for this support to fail, Your Grace, and they wished for it to fail while you were using it. The confirmation that someone within Ashcombe Hall, someone with access to the private exercise chamber that only a handful of trusted individuals knew existed, had deliberately sabotaged Alaric's equipment, settled over the room like a physical weight. Whoever had arranged the original carriage accident 3 years ago had clearly not abandoned their determination to prevent Alaric's full recovery, and the growing certainty that this danger now lurked somewhere within their own household, watching, waiting for further opportunity, left Alara more frightened than she had felt since first receiving news of this forced marriage weeks earlier. In the days that followed the discovery of the sabotage support bar, Ashcombe Hall settled into a tense, watchful quiet. Grimsby, taking the matter with the gravity it deserved, personally reviewed the household staff roster, questioning who among them had access to the private exercise chamber and when. The list, disappointingly, proved longer than any of them had hoped, including not only the handful of trusted servants who assisted with Alaric's care, but also several others who might have found opportunity to slip into the chamber unnoticed during the quiet hours before dawn, or after the household retired for the night. "It could be any one of a dozen people," Alaric said grimly, still favoring his bruised arm as he sat with Alara and Grimsby in the study, poring over the list of names. "Or it could be someone entirely outside the household staff, someone who gained access through less obvious means. We cannot simply accuse based on opportunity alone." "What of the varnish itself?" Alara asked, turning to a fresh consideration. "Surely such a specific material would not be commonly available. Perhaps we might trace its origin." Grimsby nodded slowly, considering this. "A reasonable thought, Your Grace. I shall make inquiries with the local suppliers, discreetly, to determine whether anyone has recently purchased varnish of that particular type, and whether they can recall to whom it was sold." While Grimsby pursued this new avenue of investigation, Alara found herself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Priscilla, whose return visit, as promised, drew steadily closer with each passing day. The confirmation of her connection to Edmund, combined with the suspicious timing of both her reappearance and the sabotage attempt, left Alara deeply wary of what further mischief the woman's extended stay might bring. Priscilla arrived precisely on the appointed day, this time with considerably more luggage than her brief initial visit had required, having secured, through careful persuasion of Alaric's sense of old obligation, an invitation to remain at Ashcombe Hall for a fortnight. Alara watched with growing unease as Priscilla settled into the household with practiced ease, charming the staff with small compliments and gifts, engaging Alaric in long conversations about shared memories from their youth, and always, watching Alara herself, with that same calculating assessment, barely concealed behind her polished smiles. "You seem tired, Duchess," Priscilla observed one evening, as the three of them sat together in the drawing room after dinner, Alaric's arm still bandaged from his fall, though his color had improved considerably in the days since. "I do hope the burdens of managing such a large household are not proving too taxing for you. It is, after all, rather a significant responsibility for someone unaccustomed to a house of such scale and history." "I find myself managing quite well, thank you," Alara replied evenly, refusing to rise to the subtle condescension woven through Priscilla's words. "Of course," Priscilla said, her smile widening slightly, "though I imagine it must feel rather overwhelming at times, stepping into a role you never truly prepared for. in a marriage that came about through such unusual circumstances. I do so admire your courage in accepting such an arrangement, whatever its origins. Alaric's expression darkened at this remark, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Alara placed a calm hand on his arm, silently indicating that she required no defense against Priscilla's carefully barbed observations. I have found, Alara said, meeting Priscilla's gaze directly, that circumstances matter rather less than character, in the end. A marriage that begins through necessity can still grow into something genuine, given time and honest effort from both parties involved. I imagine you understand that as well as anyone, Lady Priscilla, given your own experience with marriage and its complicated origins. Something flickered behind Priscilla's pale eyes at this pointed remark, a brief crack in her carefully maintained composure, before she smoothed it over once more with practiced grace. Indeed, she said, her voice carrying a slight edge now beneath its pleasant surface. Though I confess my own marriage taught me rather more about disappointment than genuine growth. But I am certain your circumstances shall prove considerably more fortunate than mine ultimately were. The conversation continued in this manner throughout the remainder of the evening, each woman probing carefully at the other beneath a veneer of polite civility, while Alaric watched the exchange with growing unease, clearly uncertain how best to navigate the tension simmering between his wife and his former fiancée. When Priscilla finally retired for the night, Alara remained in the drawing room with Alaric, both of them silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. I am sorry, he said quietly. I should not have allowed her extended stay. I underestimated how uncomfortable her presence might prove for you. It is not discomfort I feel, Alara said, though this was not entirely true. Some small, unwelcome jealousy stirring beneath her composed exterior whenever she witnessed the easy familiarity between Alaric and Priscilla, born of years of shared history that Alara herself could never claim. It is suspicion. Every word she speaks feels calculated, every question designed to extract information rather than genuine interest. I do not trust her, Alaric, not for a single moment. Nor do I, Alaric admitted. Though I confess I find myself uncertain how best to proceed, given that open accusation without proof would only alert her to our suspicions, while continued hospitality grants her further opportunity to pursue whatever scheme she and Edmund might be orchestrating together. They agreed, ultimately, to continue their careful watchfulness, gathering what evidence they could, while maintaining the outward appearance of polite hospitality toward their unwelcome guest. Grimsby's inquiries regarding the varnish eventually bore fruit, revealing that a small quantity of the specific type used to conceal the sabotage support bar had been purchased several weeks earlier by a man matching the general description of Jenkins, the vanished estate manager, at a shop in the nearby town. This confirms our suspicions, Alaric said grimly, once Grimsby had relayed this new information. Jenkins remains involved, still working in service to whatever conspiracy has targeted me since my father's death. The question now becomes whether he acted on his own initiative, or whether he continues to serve as an instrument for Edmund and Priscilla's shared purpose. The answer to this question arrived sooner than any of them expected, and in a manner far more dangerous than they had anticipated. 3 days into Priscilla's extended stay, Alara found herself alone in the garden late one afternoon, tending to the roses she and Alaric had begun restoring together in the weeks prior, when a sudden movement in the overgrown hedge nearby caught her attention. Before she could properly react, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man she did not immediately recognize, his face weathered and hard, his eyes carrying a desperate, dangerous intensity that sent immediate alarm racing through her chest. You should not have come looking into matters that do not concern you, Your Grace, the man said, his voice low and rough, and Alara understood immediately, with a cold, sinking certainty, that she was standing face to face with Jenkins himself. What do you want? She asked, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the fear pounding through her veins, her eyes darting quickly toward the house, calculating the distance and the likelihood of anyone hearing her should she call for help. A warning, nothing more, for now, Jenkins said, taking a slow step closer, his hands clenched at his sides. Tell your husband to cease his inquiries. Tell him to accept his condition and abandon whatever hope he has built of a full recovery. Some things, Your Grace, are better left as they are, for everyone's sake, including your own. Who sent you? Alara demanded, her fear beginning to sharpen into something closer to anger. "Who are you protecting with these threats?" Jenkins's expression flickered with something like genuine regret, quickly buried beneath renewed hardness. "That is not a question I am able to answer, Your Grace, not without placing myself and those dear to me in considerably greater danger than I already face. Simply heed my warning, for your own sake. Some secrets are guarded far too fiercely to be uncovered, without significant cost, to those who go searching for them." Before Alara could respond further, a sharp voice called out from the direction of the house, and Jenkins, startled by the sudden sound, turned and disappeared quickly back into the overgrown hedges from which he had emerged. Alara stood frozen for a long moment, her heart still racing, before Effie came hurrying into view, having apparently been sent to summon her mistress for tea, entirely unaware of how narrowly her arrival had interrupted a considerably more dangerous encounter. Alara said nothing of the incident to Effie, composing herself quickly, before following the young maid back toward the house, her mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. Jenkins had approached her directly, delivering a clear and unmistakable threat, confirming beyond any remaining doubt that the conspiracy against Alaric remained active, dangerous, and now, with this direct confrontation, considerably more willing to escalate should their investigation continue unchecked. She found Alaric in his study and relayed the encounter immediately, watching his expression darken with fury and fear in equal measure as she described Jenkins's sudden appearance and pointed warning. "He approached you directly," Alaric said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "In our own gardens, threatening you to my face, however indirectly delivered. This has gone considerably beyond anything I am willing to tolerate further, Alara. Whatever caution we have exercised until now, it clearly has not been sufficient to keep you safe. I am not willing to abandon this investigation, simply because we have been threatened," Alara said firmly, though the fear from the encounter still lingered beneath her determined exterior. "If anything, Jenkins's warning confirms that we are drawing dangerously close to whatever truth he and his associates wish to keep buried. We cannot allow fear to halt us now, not when we have come this far." Alaric studied her for a long moment, something fierce and protective burning behind his storm-colored eyes, mixed with unmistakable admiration for her courage in the face of genuine danger. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "Frightening, in your stubbornness, but remarkable nonetheless. Very well, we shall continue, but with considerably greater caution than we have exercised thus far. I will not risk your safety further, without taking every possible precaution to protect you from whatever danger Jenkins and his masters might still pose." That night, as additional guards were quietly stationed around the grounds of Ashcombe Hall at Alaric's insistence, and as Grimsby doubled his efforts to trace Jenkins's current whereabouts and associations, Alara lay awake in her chamber, turning over every detail of the frightening encounter in the garden. Jenkins's warning, however threatening, had also revealed something valuable, a confirmation that whoever guided this conspiracy from the shadows feared discovery enough to resort to direct intimidation, suggesting that the truth, whatever it fully entailed, lay closer to exposure than their enemies were comfortable allowing. Yet even as this small comfort settled over her, Alara could not shake the growing certainty that the danger surrounding them had entered a new and more perilous phase, one that would demand considerably greater courage and caution from both her and Alaric in the days ahead, if they hoped to survive long enough to finally uncover and expose the truth that had haunted Ashcombe Hall for 3 long, treacherous years. Despite the mounting danger, or perhaps in defiance of it, the weeks that followed brought Alara and Alaric closer together than either had believed possible when their forced marriage first began. Shared fear has a way of stripping away pretense, and with every quiet evening spent poring over estate documents in search of clues, every careful conversation held behind closed doors about who among their household might be trusted, Alara found herself falling ever more deeply into feelings she had never expected this arrangement to produce. Alaric's recovery, meanwhile, continued its steady, determined progress. The newly repaired exercise chamber, now guarded around the clock by staff Grimsby had personally vetted and trusted beyond question. Dr. Finch expressed continued astonishment at the pace of improvement, noting that Alaric could now walk unassisted for short distances, his gait still careful and occasionally unsteady, but undeniably his own, achieved through months of quiet, painful determination. "You will be dancing again before the year is out, Your Grace," Finch declared one afternoon, with the cheerful confidence that had become his trademark. "Provided, of course, that no further support bars mysteriously fail beneath you in the meantime." The joke, though lightly delivered, carried an edge of genuine concern that none of them could entirely dismiss, and Alara noticed Alaric's jaw tighten slightly at the reminder of how precarious their continued safety truly remained, even as his body grew steadily stronger with each passing week. Priscilla's extended stay, meanwhile, showed no sign of concluding, her fortnight visit having somehow extended itself through a series of carefully constructed excuses, each one delivered with such polished sincerity that Alaric found himself unable to gracefully insist upon her departure, without risking open confrontation, before they possessed sufficient proof of her involvement in the conspiracy against him. She continued her careful campaign of charm throughout the household, and Alara noticed with growing unease how frequently Priscilla found reason to seek out Alaric's company alone, engaging him in long conversations about their shared past, always steering discussion toward old memories designed, Alara suspected, to stir whatever lingering affection might still remain beneath his current guarded composure. It was during one such evening, when Priscilla had once again claimed Alaric's attention for an extended conversation in the drawing room, that Alara, feeling restless and increasingly frustrated by her own inability to definitively expose the woman's true intentions, decided to make use of the opportunity to search Priscilla's guest chamber, while its occupant remained safely occupied elsewhere. The search felt uncomfortably invasive, a violation of the hospitality Ashcombe Hall had extended to its guest, yet Alara reasoned that whatever discomfort she felt paled considerably beside the danger Priscilla's true purposes might represent to Alaric's continued safety. She moved carefully through the elegantly appointed chamber, searching drawers and shelves with quick, methodical thoroughness, uncertain exactly what she hoped to find, yet trusting that her instincts would recognize evidence of wrongdoing should she encounter it. Her search eventually led her to a small traveling desk, tucked discreetly in the corner of the room, and within its locked compartment, opened with a hairpin borrowed from her own careful preparation for exactly such an eventuality, Alara discovered a bundle of letters that immediately confirmed every suspicion she and Alaric had harbored regarding Priscilla's true purpose at Ashcombe Hall. The letters, exchanged between Priscilla and Edmund over the preceding months, revealed a carefully constructed scheme born of shared desperation and mutual ambition. Priscilla's late husband, it emerged, had left her with debts considerably exceeding whatever fortune remained from his failed business ventures, and Edmund, drowning in his own accumulated obligations against his expected inheritance, had proposed a partnership between them, one built upon the assumption that Alaric would never recover sufficiently to produce an heir, leaving the title and its considerable fortune to fall eventually into Edmund's hands, at which point he had promised, in careful, incriminating language, to marry Priscilla and share the inheritance jointly between them. But it was a more recent letter, dated only weeks earlier, that sent a genuine chill through Alara's chest as she read its contents by the dim light of a single candle. In it, Priscilla wrote with barely concealed alarm about Alaric's improving recovery, urging Edmund to take more decisive action before their carefully laid plans unraveled entirely, referencing, in language that stopped just short of explicit confession, the necessity of ensuring certain equipment remained less than entirely reliable, and expressing frustration that their arrangement with a man identified only as J had not yet produced the desired permanent result. Alara understood immediately that J could only refer to Jenkins, and that this letter provided the clearest evidence yet of Priscilla and Edmund's direct involvement not only in the original conspiracy that had caused Alaric's accident, but also in the more recent sabotage that had nearly caused him serious injury during his exercises. With trembling hands, she carefully copied the most incriminating passages onto a scrap of paper she had brought for exactly this purpose, then returned the letters precisely to their original position within the locked compartment, taking great care to leave no trace of her search behind. She slipped from Priscilla's chamber just as she heard footsteps approaching along the corridor outside, ducking quickly into a nearby alcove and holding her breath as Priscilla herself passed by, humming softly to herself, entirely unaware of how narrowly her secrets had nearly been exposed that very evening. Once the corridor had fallen silent once more, Ilara made her way quickly to Alaric's study, finding him there alone, apparently having finally extracted himself from Priscilla's company. "I have proof," she said, closing the door carefully behind her, before producing the copied passages with hands that still trembled slightly from the tension of her secret search. Letters between Priscilla and Edmund, discussing their scheme in language that leaves little room for innocent interpretation. Alaric read through the copied passages with growing fury, his expression darkening with each revealed detail of the conspiracy that had cost him 3 years of his mobility and very nearly his life. "This is more than sufficient to bring formal charges against both of them," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Combined with Fenwick's testimony and Jenkins's own suspicious behavior, we now possess a case that no magistrate could reasonably dismiss." "We must proceed carefully still," Ilara cautioned, her earlier fear returning, as she considered the implications of what they now knew. "If Priscilla realizes her letters have been discovered, she and Edmund may attempt to flee, or worse, may resort to more drastic measures before we can properly expose them through legal channels." Alaric nodded slowly, considering this carefully. "We will need to gather Jenkins into our custody as well, to secure his testimony, before Priscilla or Edmund realize the extent of what we have uncovered, and attempt to silence him permanently, as they clearly attempted to silence Fenwick's testimony 3 years ago." He paused, something fierce and protective settling over his features as he looked at Ilara directly. "You took considerable risk tonight, searching her chamber alone. Had you been discovered, I dread to think what danger you might have faced." "I could not simply wait for further danger to find us," Ilara said. "Not when action remained possible." Something in her steady courage seemed to move Alaric deeply, and he rose from his chair, crossing the study to stand before her, closer than their careful arrangement had generally permitted between them. "Ilara," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of emotion she had not heard from him before. "I do not know how to properly express what your courage, your loyalty, your presence in my life, these past months, has come to mean to me. I entered this marriage expecting nothing more than a dutiful arrangement, a solution to obligations neither of us had chosen. I did not expect to find someone who would fight alongside me against danger, who would see past the broken man everyone else believed me to be, who would help me believe, once again, that a full life remained possible for me." "Alaric," Ilara whispered, her heart pounding with an emotion she had been carefully guarding against, acknowledging fully these past weeks, fearful of what it might mean, given the uncertain, dangerous circumstances surrounding them both. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying none of the careful, guarded formality that had once characterized every interaction between them. "I did not intend to, and I certainly did not expect it, given how our marriage began. But I love you, Ilara, completely and without reservation, and whatever danger still surrounds us, whatever conspiracy we must yet expose and overcome, I find myself more grateful than I can properly express. That circumstance brought you into my life, even through such difficult and unwanted means." Tears gathered unexpectedly in Ilara's eyes as she absorbed his words, the culmination of everything that had grown between them since that first frightening night, when he had risen unsteadily from his chair and declared that she had given him a reason to try again. "I love you too," she said softly, the truth of it settling over her with quiet, certain clarity. "I did not expect it either, but it is true nonetheless. Whatever happens now, whatever danger we must still face together, I am glad, truly glad, that fate brought us to this moment." They stood together in the quiet study, the weight of their shared danger momentarily forgotten in the warmth of finally acknowledged love, and for a brief, precious moment, Ilara allowed herself to simply feel the joy of this unexpected happiness, before the practical concerns of their continued investigation inevitably reasserted themselves, reminding her that the conspiracy threatening them both remained active, dangerous, and increasingly desperate as their evidence against it continued to mount. The morning after their quiet declaration of love, Alaric moved swiftly to act upon the evidence Ilara had uncovered, summoning Grimsby and a small group of trusted men to devise a plan for locating and securing Jenkins before Priscilla or Edmund could realize the extent of what had been discovered. Grimsby's earlier inquiries had already narrowed Jenkins's likely location to a small inn on the outskirts of the nearby town, where he had apparently been lodging under an assumed name since his brief, threatening appearance in Ashcombe Hall's gardens. "We must move carefully," Alaric instructed the small group gathered in his study that morning. Jenkins is frightened, and frightened men can prove dangerous or unpredictable. I want him approached quietly, without violence, and brought here under circumstances that will encourage his cooperation rather than his continued silence. The plan proceeded with careful precision that afternoon, Grimsby himself leading the small party to the inn where Jenkins had been located, while Alara remained at Ashcombe Hall, tasked with maintaining the appearance of normal routine to avoid alerting Priscilla to the activity taking place beyond her awareness. The waiting proved excruciating, each passing hour stretching Alara's nerves, increasingly taut, as she forced herself through the motions of ordinary conversation with their unsuspecting guest, all the while wondering whether Grimsby's mission would succeed in bringing Jenkins safely into their custody, or whether something might yet go terribly wrong. It was well into the evening when Grimsby finally returned, his expression grim but satisfied, confirming that Jenkins had been located and, after some initial resistance, persuaded to accompany them back to Ashcombe Hall, where he now waited under careful guard in a private chamber, prepared, it seemed, to finally unburden himself of the guilt he had carried silently for 3 long years. Alara and Alaric met with Jenkins together that same evening, finding the man considerably diminished from the threatening figure who had confronted Alara in the gardens weeks earlier. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse as he sat before them in the quiet chamber, a fire burning low in the hearth nearby. "I never wished you real harm, Your Grace," Jenkins began, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. "You must believe that, whatever else I have done, I was desperate, and desperate men make terrible choices when pressed hard enough." "Tell us everything," Alaric said, his voice carrying a controlled authority that left no room for further evasion. "From the beginning, what truly happened 3 years ago, and why?" Jenkins took a long, shuddering breath before beginning his confession in earnest. "It began with your father's will, Your Grace, and certain irregularities in how the estate's finances had been managed during his final years. Irregularities I myself had been responsible for concealing, at his own instruction, to protect certain investments he had made that would not have withstood close scrutiny. When you began investigating the estate accounts more thoroughly following your father's death, I feared exposure, feared the ruin that would follow discovery of my role in concealing those irregular dealings all those years. The letter I received the night before my accident," Alaric said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn across his features. "It concerned these very irregularities." "Yes, Your Grace," Jenkins confirmed miserably. "I do not know who sent that letter. I swear it upon whatever honor I still possess, but when I learned of your intended meeting with a solicitor, I panicked, fearing that whatever truth that letter revealed would lead directly back to my own culpability in years of concealed financial mismanagement. Master Edmund approached me shortly afterward, having somehow learned of my predicament, and offered a solution that seemed, in my desperation, the only path available to me. He suggested that a delay to your journey, nothing more sinister than that, he claimed at the time, would provide sufficient opportunity for him to intercept whatever documents you intended to review, allowing us both to conceal our respective secrets before they could be properly investigated." "A delay," Alara repeated, her voice tight with disbelief and anger. "You call what happened to my husband a mere delay?" Jenkins flinched visibly at her tone. "I did not intend such severe consequence, Your Grace. I swear it. I weakened the axle only slightly, believing it would fail gradually, causing perhaps a minor accident, enough to delay the journey without genuine danger. I did not anticipate the severity of the crash that resulted, nor the lasting harm it would cause. When I understood what had truly happened, the depth of the injury you had suffered, I very nearly confessed everything to the magistrate investigating the matter. But Master Edmund threatened to expose my own role in concealing your father's financial irregularities should I speak a single word of the truth, and I feared the ruin and imprisonment that would surely follow such exposure far more than I feared my own guilt over what had happened to you." The confession settled heavily over the room, and Alara watched Alaric's expression cycle through fury, grief, and finally, something approaching weary understanding, as he absorbed the full truth of what had happened to him 3 years earlier, the tangled web of desperation and self-interest that had cost him so much of his life and happiness. "And Fenwick's dismissal?" Alaric asked finally, "the discrediting of his testimony after he witnessed your tampering that night?" Master Edmund arranged that as well, Jenkins admitted, spreading rumors of Fenwick's supposed drinking, ensuring the magistrate dismissed his claims as the unreliable ramblings of a discredited servant. I am ashamed to admit I did nothing to correct these false rumors, though I knew Fenwick had spoken the truth. And more recently, Alara pressed, the sabotaged support bar in the exercise chamber. Lady Priscilla's letters make clear your continued involvement in this conspiracy. Jenkins's shoulders sagged further. When word reached Master Edmund of your recovering health, your grace, and of your marriage to the Duchess, his desperation returned with renewed force, his creditors having grown considerably less patient in recent months, regarding debts he had assumed would be settled through his eventual inheritance. Lady Priscilla, I understand, faces similarly desperate financial circumstances of her own. Together they approached me once more, this time with considerably more explicit threats should I refuse to assist them further. I weakened the support bar as instructed, believing, foolishly perhaps, that another minor delay to your recovery might satisfy their demands, without requiring anything more serious. You call risking my life a minor delay once again, Alaric said, his voice dangerously quiet now. I have been a coward, your grace, Jenkins said, tears finally spilling down his weathered face. A coward and a fool, trapped by my own earlier deceptions, into ever deeper complicity with schemes I found increasingly monstrous, yet felt powerless to refuse, given the ruin that awaited me, should my own guilt be exposed. I confronted your wife in the gardens on Master Edmund's explicit instruction, delivering his warning rather than any threat of my own devising, though I confess, I allowed my desperation to make the delivery considerably more frightening than perhaps necessary. Alaric was silent for a long moment, processing the full weight of Jenkins's confession, before finally speaking again, his voice carrying a controlled authority that brooked no argument. You will provide this same confession, in full and complete detail, before a magistrate, in exchange for whatever leniency the courts might extend given your cooperation now. Your testimony, combined with Fenwick's original account and the letters my wife discovered in Lady Priscilla's chamber, should prove more than sufficient to bring formal charges against both my cousin and Lady Priscilla for conspiracy, attempted harm, and whatever additional charges the magistrate deems appropriate, given the full scope of their scheme. Jenkins nodded miserably, seeming almost relieved to finally have his 3 years of guilty silence brought to an end, whatever consequences might now follow from his overdue honesty. As Grimsby led the broken man away to a secure chamber where he would remain under guard until proper legal proceedings could be arranged, Ilara found herself sitting quietly beside Alaric, both of them absorbing the full weight of the truth finally uncovered, after 3 long years of uncertainty and unresolved suspicion. It began with my father's own dishonesty, Alaric said quietly, staring into the low fire with an expression of complicated grief. Irregularities he created, and Jenkins concealed on his behalf, which then cascaded into 3 years of my own suffering, all because Edmund seized upon that original weakness for his own desperate advantage. It is a bitter thing to learn that my father's choices, made long before I ever inherited this title, contributed to the very conspiracy that nearly ended my life. You are not responsible for your father's choices, Ilara said gently, taking his hand in hers, nor for Edmund's decision to exploit Jenkins's fear for his own selfish gain. Whatever darkness led to this conspiracy, you have shown remarkable strength in surviving it, and remarkable courage in fighting to reclaim your life, despite everything it cost you. Alaric turned to look at her, something grateful and tender in his expression, despite the heaviness of the evening's revelations. I could not have survived it, nor fought to reclaim what was taken from me, without you beside me these past months, he said softly. Whatever comes next, whatever confrontation with Edmund and Priscilla still awaits us, I face it now with considerably more strength than I possessed before you entered my life. Yet even as they sat together in the quiet aftermath of Jenkins's confession, both of them understood that the most dangerous confrontation still lay ahead. Edmund and Priscilla, still unaware that their conspiracy had finally been fully exposed, remained within reach, and the question of how best to confront them, how to ensure justice was properly served, without risking further danger to themselves or to Jenkins's crucial testimony, weighed heavily over the remainder of that long, exhausting night. By the following morning, it became apparent that Priscilla had noticed something amiss within the household. Her usual composed charm, replaced by a watchful tension that Alara recognized immediately as suspicion. Jenkins's sudden disappearance from whatever hiding place he had maintained near the town, combined with the unusual activity among Ashcombe Hall's staff the previous evening, had apparently reached her attention through whatever network of information she maintained, and her careful questions over breakfast carried an edge that suggested she suspected her carefully laid plans might be beginning to unravel. "You both seem rather preoccupied this morning," Priscilla observed, watching Alaric and Alara with sharp, assessing eyes, as they attempted to maintain a semblance of normal conversation over their morning meal. "Is something troubling you? I would hate to think my continued presence here has become burdensome, given the circumstances." "Nothing troubling in the least," Alaric replied, his tone carefully neutral despite the tension Alara could sense coiled beneath his composed exterior. "Merely estate matters requiring attention, nothing that need concern our guest." Priscilla's eyes narrowed slightly at this response, and Alara noticed her gaze flicker briefly toward the window, as though calculating some private consideration of her own. "Of course," she said finally, though her tone suggested she remained unconvinced. "I do hope, however, that whatever business occupies you does not interfere with our planned excursion to the village this afternoon. I had rather hoped to visit the shops before my stay concludes." The excursion, previously arranged as a simple pleasantry, now took on considerably greater significance given the morning's tension, and Alaric exchanged a brief, meaningful glance with Alara before agreeing to the outing, both of them silently recognizing the opportunity it presented to observe whether Priscilla intended to use the trip as cover for some more urgent purpose, perhaps an attempt to contact Edmund directly regarding their suddenly compromised situation. Grimsby, meanwhile, had been dispatched quietly that morning to alert the local magistrate, a stern but fair man named Magistrate Holloway, of the evidence they had gathered against Edmund and Priscilla, arranging for his presence at Ashcombe Hall the following day to formally receive Jenkins's confession and determine the appropriate legal proceedings against the conspirators. The plan required careful timing, ensuring that Edmund could be summoned to the estate under some plausible pretext before either he or Priscilla realized the full extent of what had been uncovered against them, allowing both conspirators to be confronted and formally charged simultaneously, preventing either from fleeing before justice could be properly served. The afternoon excursion to the village proceeded with outward normalcy, Priscilla examining ribbons and fabrics at the local shops with apparent enthusiasm, though Alara noticed her attention repeatedly drifting toward the street outside, watching for something or someone with barely concealed anxiety. It was during this outing that Alara's suspicions were confirmed beyond doubt, as she observed, from a discreet distance, Priscilla slipping a folded note to a young boy loitering near the shop entrance, pressing a coin into his palm, alongside brief, urgent instructions, before returning to her shopping with forced casualness. Alara relayed this observation to Alaric immediately upon their return to Ashcombe Hall, and together they agreed that whatever message Priscilla had sent likely carried warning to Edmund regarding their compromised position, meaning that any delay in confronting the conspirators risked allowing them to flee before Magistrate Holloway could arrive to formally address the matter. "We cannot wait until tomorrow," Alaric said grimly, pacing the length of his study with steps that, Alara noted with quiet pride despite the tension of the moment, had grown remarkably steady over these past months of careful recovery. "If Edmund receives warning tonight, he may attempt to flee the country entirely, taking Priscilla with him, and we would lose any opportunity to see proper justice served for what they have done. Then we must act tonight," Alara said firmly. "Send word to Magistrate Holloway immediately, requesting his presence as soon as possible, even if it means rousing him from his bed in the middle of the night. We cannot allow them the opportunity to escape now, not after everything we have uncovered." Grimsby was dispatched immediately with an urgent message for the magistrate, while Alaric and Alara turned their attention to ensuring Priscilla remained unaware of their intentions for as long as possible, maintaining careful, ordinary conversation with her throughout the evening meal, despite the considerable tension simmering beneath their outward composure. Alara noticed Priscilla's own nervous energy growing throughout the evening, her usual polished charm beginning to fray at the edges, as whatever message she had sent to Edmund apparently failed to produce any immediate response. It was well past midnight when Magistrate Holloway finally arrived at Ashcombe Hall, accompanied by 2 constables and bearing the stern, methodical demeanor of a man well accustomed to handling delicate legal matters among the aristocracy, with appropriate discretion. Alaric met with him privately first, presenting the full evidence they had gathered, the copied letters, Fenwick's earlier testimony, and finally Jenkins himself, brought from his guarded chamber to formally repeat his confession, before the magistrate's careful questioning. Holloway listened with grave attention throughout Jenkins's lengthy account, occasionally pausing to clarify certain details or press for additional specifics regarding dates and circumstances, and by the time the confession concluded, his expression had settled into the hard, determined look of a man who fully intended to see justice properly served, regardless of the social standing of those involved. "This is more than sufficient grounds for formal arrest," Holloway declared finally. "Conspiracy to cause grievous harm, attempted concealment of estate fraud, and continued conspiracy against your recovery and safety, Your Grace, represent serious charges indeed. I shall need to speak with Lady Priscilla and Master Edmund directly to formally present these charges and take them into custody pending trial." "Edmund is not currently present at Ashcombe Hall," Alaric said, "though we believe Lady Priscilla may have sent warning to him earlier today regarding our discoveries. I fear he may attempt to flee before you can properly apprehend him." Holloway's expression sharpened with renewed urgency at this information. "Then we must move quickly, before any further warning reaches him. I shall dispatch my constables to secure Master Edmund's known residences immediately, while I proceed to formally confront Lady Priscilla here at Ashcombe Hall." The confrontation that followed proved considerably more dramatic than any of them had anticipated. Priscilla, roused from her chamber by Grimsby's careful summons, arrived in the drawing room still dressed in her nightclothes, beneath a hastily donned robe, her expression cycling rapidly from confusion to alarm as she took in the presence of the magistrate and his stern-faced constables. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" she demanded, her voice carrying a brittle edge that suggested she already sensed, with dawning horror, the true purpose behind this unexpected midnight gathering. "Lady Priscilla Ashworth," Magistrate Holloway said, his voice carrying formal authority that filled the room with sudden, weighty tension. "I am here to formally charge you with conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm against the Duke of Ashcombe, both in the matter of the carriage accident 3 years past, and in the more recent sabotage of equipment intended for his continued recovery. You will accompany my constables immediately for formal questioning, pending trial before proper legal authority." For a moment, Priscilla's carefully maintained composure shattered entirely, her face draining of color as she looked wildly between Alaric, Ilara, and the stern magistrate, now advancing toward her, with clear intent to see the formal charges carried out immediately. "This is absurd," she said, though her voice trembled with obvious panic, rather than genuine conviction. "I have done nothing wrong. Whatever lies you have been told, whatever fabricated evidence has been presented against me, I assure you, it is entirely without merit." "We have your own letters, Priscilla," Alaric said quietly, stepping forward with steady, deliberate steps that carried none of the uncertainty that had characterized his movements only months before. "Your correspondence with Edmund, discussing your scheme in language that leaves little room for innocent interpretation. We have Jenkins's full confession, detailing your explicit instructions regarding the sabotage of my exercise equipment. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and further denial serves no purpose beyond delaying the inevitable." Priscilla's eyes darted toward the door, some desperate calculation flickering behind her panicked expression, and for a moment, Ilara feared she might attempt some final, reckless bid for escape. But the constables moved quickly to block any such attempt, and Priscilla's shoulders finally slumped in defeat. The elegant, controlled woman, who had charmed her way through Ashcombe Hall's household these past weeks, collapsing entirely into something considerably more desperate and pitiable. "I did what circumstances demanded of me," she said finally, her voice bitter, with 3 years of accumulated resentment and desperation. "You cannot understand what it means to lose everything, Alaric, to watch your fortune and your security disappear, through no true fault of your own, while others retain every advantage life has granted them, without effort or struggle. Edmund offered a solution to my desperate circumstances, and I took it, whatever consequence that choice now brings upon me. Your desperation does not excuse nearly ending my life," Alaric said, his voice carrying quiet, controlled fury beneath its measured tone. "Nor does it excuse the continued danger you and Edmund have posed to my wife, and to countless others, whose lives you have manipulated for your own selfish advantage these past 3 years. As the constables led Priscilla away into the custody that would eventually see her formally tried and convicted for her role in the conspiracy, word arrived shortly after dawn that Edmund himself had been apprehended attempting to flee toward the coast, his carriage intercepted by Holloway's constables before he could secure passage on a ship bound for the continent. The full scope of the conspiracy that had haunted Ashcombe Hall for 3 long years finally lay exposed and dismantled, its architects secured for the justice that would soon follow, and as morning light finally broke over the estate's neglected but slowly recovering gardens, Elara and Alaric stood together on the terrace, watching the sunrise with the profound relief of 2 people who had finally, after months of careful investigation and mounting danger, secured both truth and safety for the life they had begun building together, against every expectation either had originally held for this forced and unwanted marriage. The weeks that followed brought a flurry of legal proceedings, as Magistrate Holloway worked methodically to build the formal case against both Edmund and Priscilla, drawing upon Jenkins's detailed confession, Fenwick's long-suppressed testimony, and the damning letters Elara had discovered, to construct an overwhelming body of evidence that left little room for either conspirator to mount any credible defense. Edmund, faced with the certainty of conviction, eventually offered his own confession in exchange for whatever leniency the court might extend, revealing additional details of the conspiracy that further confirmed the depth of his desperate scheming against his own cousin's life and well-being. News of the conspiracy inevitably spread through society, with the swift, merciless efficiency such scandals always seemed to command, and for a time, Ashcombe Hall found itself the subject of considerable gossip and speculation, curious visitors and concerned relatives arriving with increasing frequency to express their shock and sympathy regarding the terrible truth finally uncovered after 3 years of unresolved suspicion. Alaric bore this renewed attention with a composure that Elara found herself admiring more each day, no longer the withdrawn, isolated figure society had once whispered about with pity, but a man who met each visitor with quiet dignity, willing at last to acknowledge both the pain of what he had suffered and the hope of what his continued recovery now promised. Dr. Finch, freed from any lingering concern regarding sabotage or interference, redoubled his efforts with Alaric's continued exercises, and the progress that followed exceeded even his most optimistic predictions. Within a matter of weeks, Alaric could walk the length of Ashcombe Hall's long corridors without need of support, his gait growing steadily more confident and natural with each passing day, though he still tired more easily than a man who had never suffered such injury, and certain movements remained permanently more difficult than they might otherwise have been. "You will never regain everything the accident took from you," Finch admitted honestly during one of their sessions, as Alaric completed a careful set of exercises in the newly repaired chamber, its equipment now inspected daily by trusted staff, to ensure no further sabotage could threaten his continued progress. "Some limitations, I believe, will remain permanent features of your condition, but what you have achieved already, Your Grace, stands as remarkable testament to your determination, and I see no reason why you should not continue building upon this progress for years to come, provided you continue exercising the same careful diligence you have shown thus far." Alaric accepted this honest assessment with a grace that Elara found deeply moving, no longer viewing his condition through the lens of loss and bitterness that had once defined his existence, but instead embracing the progress he had achieved as genuine victory, however incomplete it might ultimately remain. "I have learned," he told Elara one evening, as they walked together through the gardens they had spent months carefully restoring, "that a full life need not require a fully restored body. I spent 3 years believing myself broken beyond redemption, defining my entire existence by what the accident had taken from me. It took your presence in my life, Elara, to remind me that there remained so much still worth living for, whatever limitations might permanently remain." As formal legal proceedings against Edmund and Priscilla drew toward their conclusion, Alaric received word that his standing within society, once diminished by years of isolation and quiet suffering, had been thoroughly restored, indeed enhanced, by the courage he had shown in confronting and exposing the conspiracy against him. Invitations began arriving with renewed frequency, and though Alaric approached this returning social attention with characteristic caution, he found himself, with Elara's gentle encouragement, gradually willing to re-engage with the world beyond Ashcombe Hall's walls in ways he had not permitted himself since his accident 3 years earlier. It was during this period of gradual healing and restored reputation that Alaric proposed a formal celebration to mark both the conclusion of the difficult legal proceedings and, more personally, the genuine partnership that had grown between himself and Alara over these tumultuous months, a partnership that had transformed from forced obligation into something neither had expected to find, yet both now treasured beyond measure. A ball, he suggested one evening, as they sat together in the drawing room that had witnessed so many difficult conversations over the preceding months. Here at Ashcombe Hall, to formally reintroduce ourselves to society, not as the tragic, isolated Duke and his dutiful bride, but as who we have truly become together. I find I wish for the world to see what you have helped me rebuild, Alara, both in body and in spirit. Alara agreed with genuine enthusiasm, and the following weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. The long-neglected ballroom of Ashcombe Hall polished and restored to its former grandeur. The gardens Alara and Alaric had lovingly tended, finally blooming with the roses that had once been his mother's particular pride, now flourishing once more under careful, dedicated attention. The night of the ball arrived with a clear, star-filled sky that seemed almost deliberately designed to complement the joy of the occasion. Guests arrived in impressive numbers, curious to witness for themselves the remarkable recovery that had transformed the once tragically isolated Duke into a figure of genuine admiration and respect throughout society. His courage, in confronting the conspiracy against him, now widely celebrated rather than pitied. Alara stood beside Alaric as they greeted their guests, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that caught the candlelight beautifully, and she found herself marveling, as she often did these days, at how completely her life had transformed since that terrible morning when her father's shaking voice had first informed her of the marriage being forced upon her. What had begun as a desperate arrangement born of financial necessity had grown, through months of shared danger and mutual discovery, into a genuine partnership built upon respect, courage, and increasingly undeniable love. As the evening progressed and the orchestra began the first strains of a waltz, Alaric turned to Alara with an expression of quiet, determined intention that immediately caught her full attention. "Would you do me the honor," he said, extending his hand toward her with steady, confident grace, "of sharing this dance with me?" Alara's breath caught in her throat as she understood the significance of his request. Alaric had not danced since his accident 3 years earlier, and though his recovery had progressed remarkably in recent months, she had not been certain he felt ready to attempt something as physically demanding as a full waltz before the assembled eyes of society. "Are you certain?" she asked softly, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or doubt. "I have never been more certain of anything," he replied, his eyes carrying the same fierce determination she had witnessed on their wedding night, when he had first risen from his chair to declare that she had given him a reason to try again. "Dance with me, Alara, before all of society, as proof that whatever this life has taken from us, we have found something considerably more valuable in return." She took his offered hand, and together they moved onto the ballroom floor, the assembled guests falling into a hushed, wondering silence as they recognized the significance of what they were witnessing. Alaric led her through the steps of the waltz with careful, deliberate grace, his movements perhaps lacking the effortless fluidity he might once have possessed before his accident, yet carrying an undeniable strength and determination that made the performance all the more remarkable for what it represented. As they turned slowly beneath the ballroom's grand chandeliers, Alara felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, overwhelmed by the profound joy of this moment, the culmination of everything they had fought through together over these past difficult months. When the waltz finally concluded, the assembled guests broke into spontaneous, genuine applause, no longer the polite courtesy extended to a pitied nobleman, but true celebration of a remarkable triumph, both physical and deeply personal. "Thank you," Alaric said quietly, once the applause had finally subsided and the orchestra had moved into a new, livelier tune that drew other couples onto the floor around them. "For fighting alongside me against dangers neither of us anticipated when this marriage first began. For teaching me that love could still find its way into a life I had believed permanently broken beyond such possibility." "Thank you," Alara replied, her heart full with an emotion she had never expected this forced, unwanted marriage to eventually produce. For showing me that even the most difficult circumstances can grow into something genuinely beautiful, given enough courage and enough time. I would not trade this life we have built together for any other future I might have imagined for myself before that terrible morning when my father first told me of the marriage awaiting me here. As the ball continued long into the night, filled with music and laughter and the genuine warmth of society, finally welcoming them both back into its embrace, Alara found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. From fearful bride facing an uncertain future with a stranger, to devoted wife standing beside a man she had come to love with her whole heart, having faced and overcome dangers neither had anticipated when this strange, forced union first began. Whatever challenges might still await them in the years ahead, she felt certain, standing there in Alaric's arms beneath the grand chandeliers of Ashcombe Hall, that they would face them together, bound now not by mere contractual obligation, but by a genuine partnership forged through shared adversity, and, ultimately, by love that had grown far stronger than either of them had ever believed possible. A full year passed following that memorable ball, bringing with it changes to Ashcombe Hall that Alara could scarcely have imagined during those first frightened days of her forced marriage. Edmund and Priscilla had both been formally convicted at trial, their sentences reflecting the severity of their conspiracy, and their names had become, within society's ever-shifting attention, cautionary tales of ambition and desperation carried too far beyond the bounds of decency. Jenkins, in recognition of his eventual cooperation and genuine remorse, received a considerably reduced sentence, and Alaric, in a gesture of quiet grace that Alara found deeply moving, arranged for the man's family to receive modest support during his years of confinement, believing that the cycle of desperation, which had originally led Jenkins toward such terrible choices, deserved compassion alongside justice. Fenwick, whose courage in finally speaking the truth had proven instrumental in unraveling the conspiracy, returned to Ashcombe Hall at Alaric's personal invitation, resuming his former position as head groom, with a dignity and gratitude that brought genuine warmth to the household's daily rhythms. The old stables, like the gardens before them, flourished once more under his devoted care, and Alara often found herself pausing during her morning walks to watch him work, grateful for the small measure of justice his restored position represented after years of unfair discredit. Alaric's recovery, meanwhile, had continued its steady, remarkable progress throughout the year, until he moved through Ashcombe Hall's halls and grounds with a confidence and ease that few who had known him during his years of isolation would have believed possible. Dr. Finch continued his regular visits, though their purpose had gradually shifted from urgent therapeutic necessity toward simple maintenance of the strength Alaric had worked so diligently to reclaim, and the physician had become, over the course of that eventful year, a genuine friend to the household rather than merely a professional visitor. The gardens Alara and Alaric had first begun restoring together during those early, uncertain weeks of their marriage had blossomed into something truly magnificent. The roses, that had once belonged to Alaric's mother, now flourishing with a vibrancy that seemed to mirror the transformation of the household itself, from a place of isolation and quiet suffering into a home filled once more with genuine warmth and purpose. Alara had taken to spending long afternoons among those roses, tending to them with the same careful devotion she had once poured into her husband's recovery, finding in their steady growth a quiet metaphor for everything their marriage had become. It was on one such afternoon, as autumn light filtered golden through the garden's carefully restored hedges, that Alara found herself sharing news with Alaric that would prove the final, joyful culmination of everything they had built together over that remarkable year. She found him seated on a bench near the roses, a book resting unopened on his lap, his attention instead fixed on the play of light through the branches of his mother's favorite oak tree, and something in his peaceful, contemplative expression made her heart swell with the particular tenderness that had grown steadily within her since that first frightened wedding night, now transformed entirely into deep, abiding love. "I have news," she said, settling beside him on the bench, taking his hand in hers, with a smile she could not quite suppress, despite her attempts at composure. "You seem rather pleased with yourself," Alaric observed, studying her expression with the perceptive attention that had become such a familiar, comforting feature of their relationship over the preceding months. What news could possibly account for such evident joy? "We are to have a child," Ilara said softly, watching carefully for his reaction, uncertain how this news might settle over a man who had spent 3 years believing such a future entirely closed to him. For a long moment, Alaric said nothing at all, his expression frozen in what Ilara initially feared might be shock or dismay, before she recognized, with growing relief, that the stillness reflected instead an overwhelming flood of emotion too profound for immediate words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a depth of feeling she had rarely heard from him, even during their most tender private moments. "A child," he repeated, as though testing the reality of the words. "Ilara, I spent 3 years believing myself permanently broken, incapable of ever building the family I had once hoped for during my youth, before the accident took so much from me. I had made peace, or believed I had made peace, with a future entirely devoid of such possibility. And now you tell me that we are to have a child, a genuine future, a family of our own, here at Ashcombe Hall, where I once believed only isolation and quiet suffering would ever remain possible for me. You have earned this happiness," Ilara said gently, moving closer to rest her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "Through every difficult month of recovery, through every dangerous confrontation with those who sought to keep you broken and isolated, you have fought for the possibility of exactly this future. I am simply grateful to have been beside you throughout that fight, and gratefully anticipating whatever joy still awaits us both in the years ahead." Alaric wrapped his arms around her then, holding her close as the golden autumn light filtered down through his mother's beloved oak tree, and Ilara felt, in that quiet, perfect moment, the full culmination of everything their remarkable journey together had built. What had begun as a desperate, forced arrangement between two strangers, each burdened by circumstances entirely beyond their control, had grown, through shared danger and mutual discovery, through patient healing and dawning love, into a genuine partnership that neither could have imagined possible during those first frightened days of their marriage. The following months brought further healing and growth to Ashcombe Hall, the household settling into joyful anticipation of the child soon to arrive, while Alaric's continued recovery reached what Dr. Finch declared to be its natural, remarkable conclusion, the Duke walking, and even occasionally running through the gardens he had helped restore, with a strength and confidence that few could have predicted during those dark early days following his terrible accident. On a bright spring morning, nearly 2 years after that first frightened wedding night, when Alaric had risen unsteadily from his chair to declare that Ilara had given him a reason to try again, their daughter was born within the walls of Ashcombe Hall, her arrival greeted with a joy that seemed to fill every corner of the ancient house with warmth and renewed purpose. They named her Margaret, after Alaric's own long-departed mother, whose beloved roses continued to bloom each spring in the gardens below the nursery window, a living testament to the healing and renewal that had transformed Ashcombe Hall from a place of isolation and quiet suffering into a genuine, thriving home. Standing together at that nursery window some weeks later, watching their infant daughter sleep peacefully in Alara's arms, while afternoon light filtered warm and golden through the glass, Alaric found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment of profound happiness. "I once believed," he said quietly, "that the accident had taken everything meaningful from my life, that I would spend whatever years remained to me, trapped within isolation and quiet despair, forever separated from the future I had once hoped for during my careless youth. I did not understand then that sometimes our greatest tragedies create space for entirely unexpected blessings, provided we remain willing to fight for the possibility of healing, and fortunate enough to find someone willing to fight alongside us. We fought for this together," Ilara said softly, leaning against him with their sleeping daughter cradled gently between them. "Every difficult step of recovery, every dangerous confrontation with those who sought to keep us apart and keep you broken, we faced together, and I believe that shared struggle made whatever happiness we have found together considerably more precious than it might otherwise have been." Outside their window, the gardens of Ashcombe Hall continued their steady, seasonal renewal, roses blooming each spring, with the same quiet persistence that had characterized Alaric's own remarkable recovery, and as Ilara looked out over those flourishing grounds, she found herself deeply, profoundly grateful for the strange, unexpected path that had brought her here. From a fearful bride facing an uncertain forced marriage, to a woman who had found, against every original expectation, a genuine partnership built upon courage, resilience, and love, strong enough to overcome even the most desperate conspiracies arrayed against it. Whatever challenges the future might yet hold, she felt certain, standing there with her small family in that quiet, sunlit nursery, that they would face them together, bound now not by the cold obligations of a forced contract, but by a devotion that had grown, through fire and hardship, into something genuinely, permanently unbreakable.